All right, good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock. We'll give it a couple more minutes. I see we have a few more people joining yet, so just everyone wants to hang out and we'll get started in just a couple minutes. All right, everyone, we'll get started at, let's give it till 10:05. I know we got a couple people still joining, so we'll give it a couple more minutes. We're going to give it one more minute. We'll get started here at 10:05. Okay, everyone. The hour of 10:05 having arrived, I think we'll get started here. I think we have most of the members. Looks like we have a couple more still joining, but I think we'll dive in. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 8th meeting of the Governor's Task Force on Reducing Prescription Drug Prices, and also our last scheduled meeting for calendar year 2020. As we've talked about previously, today's meeting is going to be really focused on having a discussion of the policy proposals that have surfaced throughout this process. And we really want to focus on those policy items where we haven't had a chance to really dive into them yet. So we hopefully will have enough time here over the next 4 hours to work through a number of these issues. We're also going to take some time to provide an update on the status of the report that we'll be submitting to the governor next month, which will summarize the work of the task force, as well as including some recommendations that we'll hopefully be forwarding. But before we dive in, just a few housekeeping items as usual. First of all, again, you'll notice I'm wearing a mask. We continue to want to model good mask wearing behavior and encourage everyone when they're out of their home, and especially in indoors outside of their home, to wear a mask. So I will have a mask on, so I'll try to speak up and articulate as much as possible, but if people are having a hard time hearing me, please let me know. As always, just a reminder, this is a public meeting, so we do have members of the public who are listening, but they will be muted and not be participating. As we've done with the previous meetings, again, please use the chat box. If you have any questions or any comments during the discussion. And of course, as with all these virtual meetings, please keep yourself muted if you're not talking to try to minimize any background noise. And then also, because we are going to be having a pretty broad policy discussion today, and I know I've heard from folks either through comment letters or some of the one-on-one calls we've done, I might be calling on people individually if I know there's a perspective that we might want to hear on a specific issue that we're talking through. So I will pause there on the housekeeping items, ask if there are any questions at this point. Okay. So seeing none, I think we're going to keep our fingers crossed and try playing another consumer video. Hopefully we have the audio issues worked out from before. So Megan, please play the video.
So I'm an RN with a Bachelor of Science degree, and I got that in 1981. I was very dynamic. I was an ICU supervisor by the time I was 26. I was active in everything. And then when I was about 32, I started having really significant symptoms. And I lived in the Chicago area, so I went to Rush. I went everywhere. I went to Loyola. Nobody could figure out what was going on. So I went to Mayo Clinic in 1995, and Dr. Lucanetti said, "You have MS." And for many years, it was relapsing remitting. So I'd be fine for a while, and then I'd get really sick, for a matter of weeks or so, and have really scary symptoms, and then they would go away, and I would be normal. Nobody could tell I had this disease for a long time. And then about, I would say, 15 years ago or so, it just became so severe with my problems with walking, especially. That's especially my problem. Other things that I had over the years that came and went haven't stuck with me, but this disease is progressive. And so, I'm 61 now, had it 35 plus years, and now it's at the point where I have a really hard time walking. That's my main thing. Well, when I first was diagnosed, there were no medications for this disease. You just had to let it destroy you. There was nothing. But now there are about a dozen medications orally. I would say the medications have been developed over about the last 20 years or so. But some of the medications I take are ones that other people take with bladder issues. Since MS is in the brain, it can attack any organ, any system, just because it feels like it. And so I have a lot of issues with various body parts. I have specialists for all of those. And a lot of those medicines are on the regular formularies Other people take them for similar issues without MS. Out of pocket per month, I have great insurance with my husband's employer, but out of pocket per month is $500 just for the regular medicines that other people take. The 2 MS medications that I'm on cost over $100,000 a year. Of that, I pay about $700-800 a year total out of pocket. The insurance is covering it. However, none of the MS medications are on the Medicare formulary at all. And I'm 61. And in a couple of years, I will have to just quit them. And the MS will progress because these medicines kind of stall the disease a bit, slow down the progression. And I know people who are over 65, they just have to quit it because there's no way out of pocket you could afford $100,000 plus a year for your prescriptions. There's just no way. So 44% of people with MS at any age don't take the medicines their doctors have prescribed because they just can't afford the out-of-pocket costs. So they just go on untreated and their disease just marches ahead a lot faster than the people who can have insurance like I do and afford it for now, for 4 more years. And then because it's not in the Medicare formulary, I'm just out. I just have to let the disease run its course. There's nothing I can do. At its peak, somebody with this disease who either can't afford the medicines to slow it down or stall it, or has to get off of them because of Medicare or they are uninsured or whatever. MS attacks the bowels, the bladder, the brain, your ability to walk, your ability to move. The more advanced cases of MS, they are wheelchair confined. Some people are bedridden. Some people can't swallow anymore. So MS is not noted as a fatal disease, but it is because it takes away critical functions that you need to survive. If you can't walk, you're in a wheelchair. If you're too sick for a wheelchair because your arms also don't work and you're bedridden, you know, from a medical standpoint, we learned about what's caused the hazards of immobility. So if you're immobile, like you're bedridden for whatever disease or reason, you are prone to bed sores, you are prone to infections, you are prone to all kinds of terrible things on top of it. And a lot of people die from the things on top of being immobile rather than the root cause. But what this looks like if you're not on the medicines is you are in a wheelchair or you are bedridden because your brain no longer can send signals to your arms, to your legs, to your swallowing mechanism, to your breathing mechanism. Wherever the disease decides to form what's called a plaque in your brain, wherever that plaque forms, that ability is gone. And they are trying to develop medicines for people in the later stages to destroy plaques, etc. It's worked in mice, but the money hasn't been there to further the research enough so that we can see if we can help humans with advanced stages of the disease. All the medicines are for people in earlier stages, and they didn't come along till I'd had this disease a really long time. So I'm afraid. I'm afraid of being wheelchair bound. I'm afraid of being bedridden. I'm afraid of dying. And that fear is magnified when I think about not being able to afford these medicines. And a lot of people can't. Them to know that part of the problem of the expense is pharmacy benefit managers, which I only learned about last year because I went to the MS Public Policy Conference in Washington, D.C., and we spoke to Congress and the Senate about price of drugs, making drugs inaccessible to people. I'd like them to know that I think pharmacy benefit managers, which are not regulated, and which Wisconsin hasn't even tried to regulate. Many states have. I could just email you a couple articles I found on which states have. Wisconsin hasn't even tried to regulate them, number one. And number two, we need to get the MS drugs on the Medicare formulary. We want to live longer than 65, like a lot of other people. And okay, so I can't walk very well. I would like to stall out where I am right now. Where I am right now is bad enough. But if those drugs aren't on the Medicare formulary in 4 years, it's gonna be terrible.
That's really some
So
powerful
I'm an RN.
commentary from Annette, and we really appreciate her sharing her story. And I think she touched on a lot of the issues that we've heard about and we know are major problems when it comes to people being able to access the drugs that they need, and just the affordability challenges that too many people face when it comes to life-saving and just really needed medication. So we really appreciate her sharing that story. I know I've heard from a number of people on the task force as well as others that they've appreciated hearing the consumer experience stories as we've gone through this process, because it's really helped to reinforce why we're doing this work, and that there is a real a real face on the work that we're doing. Yes, we're talking policy and we're talking legal matters, but at the end of the day, it's really about the impact that it has on real people. So we really appreciate Annette and the others sharing their stories throughout this process. And I also want to take a minute to thank Derek Spellman on our team. He's really done a great job. He's done the outreach and worked with the various consumers to record their stories and do the editing work. So really appreciate all the work that he's done on that front. So now I'm going to take a few minutes and just talk through the plan for today's discussion. So yesterday morning, everyone should have received a memo, and we'll be using that memo as a guide for the discussion today. And in addition to guiding today's discussion, the memo will also serve as a framework for the final report that will be submitted to the governor next month. So if everyone doesn't have that memo in front of them, I would encourage you to pull it up or get a hard copy. You can see obviously the beginning section on the screen right now. So this document is really focused on highlighting the recommendations and the other policy options that we anticipate including in the September report to the governor. And as I mentioned, will serve as a framework for that report. So as we look at it, how we're thinking of structuring this is, the provisions included in AB 114, SB 100 will be included in the report because we have talked about those. I know there is general support from most of the task force members for seeing those get enacted. I know a lot of work has gone into that amended bill. So we will include a reference to those provisions in the report. And then beyond that, what we're looking at doing is having 3 additional tiers, kind of representing the varying levels of task force support that's been expressed at the meetings and through the various comment letters that we've received. So in the first tier, we'll have items that have really a strong support from a majority of the task force members, and which we will consider to be recommendations. The second tier will consist of other policy options that have surfaced, that have been discussed, but which do have some task force members have expressed concern or opposition to those. And then the third tier will be items that frankly have come to light just recently in conversations that we've had over the last few weeks with various task force members that we wanted to include in the report, but also want to acknowledge that we haven't necessarily had time to dive into these items and really have a thorough policy discussion. So I'm hoping we can get to a number of these today, because these are newer topics, and I know some people have brought them up and feel very strongly about them. But for now, they're on the memo as a kind of a placeholder. As it says here in the overview of this document, the final report will also include the additional explanation for each of the recommendations, as well as a summary rationale for pursuing each of them. And then we'll also reference other state laws or descriptions of other policies that can serve as a direction for the recommendations, and also to help the governor and his staff kind of conceptualize what these recommendations would look like as they build them out. We do not plan to have the final report include specific proposed legislative language or any specific details relating to kind of operationalizing each of the recommendations. Um, we're also going to include all of the comment letters that we've received, both from task force members and from various interested parties and the public, as an appendix to the report. You know, we think this is important because I know there are a lot of strong viewpoints on the different items that have surfaced, and rather than trying to pull all those comments into the report and us reflect the different viewpoints of task force members and stakeholders, we feel that just including the comment letters will be helpful for the governor and his staff as they look at potentially advancing some of these. And, you know, again, we would recommend or welcome, I guess, and encourage any task force members who feel strongly about any items that maybe aren't recommended or are recommended and you don't oppose or you don't support them to include your own comment letters as well between now and the end of August. I also want to just highlight the charge of the task force as it was outlined in Executive Order 39. I wanted to put this in the memo just as a reminder to ground us in the work that we've been doing and to remember you know, what we are supposed to be focused on based on the executive order. And when you look at the charge, you know, the second sentence that says the task force shall do the following, you know, I feel like we've done a pretty good job of doing the things that are outlined in those bullet points. And then for the last bullet, you know, we'll be issuing that report to the governor again next month, which will include a summary of our work and then the potential recommendations based on the discussions that we've had to date, as well as the discussion we'll have today. So I will stop there, ask if there are any general questions about how this memo is structured, how we're thinking about structuring the report, before we start to dive into the actual policy items. So, any questions?
Yeah, hi, it's Mike Goldrose, and I've got a question maybe aimed to the members of the state legislature that are on the task force, you know, particularly for items in the second tier in the recommendations, the other policy options for consideration. How will those that are, you know, pondering these items for action at the next level, I mean, view them? Will they be more likely taken as things that, you know, we may have strongly thought were good ideas, but maybe there was a couple people in opposition, versus things that, you know, maybe somebody thought was something we should, you know, place in the recommendations, but had pretty strong opposition? I mean, because it seems to me that, you know, some of those second tier items are certainly not something that we wholeheartedly support. And I'm just wondering on people that are not on the task force meeting here, how they're going to view those recommendations.
Sure. Well, I can speak to that in terms of how we're thinking of the report and kind of transferring this information to the governor. And then I can turn it over to any of the legislators who might want to provide the legislative perspective. You know, we felt it was important to include those items, even though, to your point, they don't necessarily have majority support. In some cases, there might only be a member or two who have said this is an item that they do support and would like to see advanced. You know, however, we feel because there is such a diverse set of perspectives and opinions around the table that we didn't want to necessarily exclude any of the policy items that have surfaced that have some support. You know, there were a few items that we didn't include where it seemed just overwhelmingly no one really supported moving forward with them. But, you know, we didn't want to also characterize those items as formal recommendations of the task force. So that's why we created it as a tiered model where we have the first tier saying these are things that the task force, for the most part, has majority support for saying we recommend. But then also saying, here are other items that have come up where there are some members who have said, these are good things, we support moving forward with them. We're not saying they're necessarily recommendations, but we are saying these are ideas that are out there. Other states are looking at them. Some stakeholders do support them. You know, governor, legislators, they might merit further consideration. And we're just going to forward this information to you. And then you, governor, legislators can decide if you want to carry that forward, if you want to support it further. Does that help answer your question?
Sure, thank you.
Okay. I mean, and I guess part of it too, a second part of that response would be, you know, as I've said before, you know, we really view this part of the work of the task force as the first step of a multi-step process. I mean, we know that, you know, when we put recommendations forward, those still need to have support, you know, from the governor and the legislature if they're going to have a chance of being, you know, advanced through the legislative process and potentially enacted as new laws. And that's where, you know, we really want to the charge of the task force of summarizing our work. We want to summarize the work in a way that is comprehensive of all of the policy ideas we've heard, recognizing then that, you know, all those stakeholders and interested parties will likely to continue to be engaged in the next step and the step after that in this process as we move into the legislative process beginning in January, and then potentially seeing some of these items move forward through that process. So that's part of the thinking of how this is structured as well. So I don't know if any of the legislators on the panel would like to speak to that and provide their perspective.
Hey, Nathan, it's Tyler. I'll just maybe weigh in and say I really appreciate the way that you've gone about structuring kind of the report. You know, as we find out, as we've kind of peeled back a little bit, there are some things that are just low-hanging fruit that are common sense that I think shouldn't be too large of lifts. But then, like Michael brought up, there's kind of this middle group where there are things that maybe we should at least look at, but that's kind of part of the policy making too. And I would approach it that way, as that second tier, kind of realizing that these are ideas, vet them, and then of course, as organizations and can try and get in and find some kind of compromise. I can't imagine, I mean, sort of depending on what it is, but things can either be, sorry, be adjusted and you know, amended and kind of pared down and shaped from there. So I would see it as a good kind of jumping off point to get started on, you know, looking at what, but maybe not the final end solution, and you know, kind of building a coalition around one particular idea. I don't know if that makes sense. Sorry, my kid. We have daddy daycare today too.
The challenges of working from home, right? No, thanks. I think that's really helpful. I appreciate that perspective.
I would echo a lot of what Tyler said. And I would add that when I see things that talk about, you know, things that didn't necessarily have full support, but were sort of merited a deeper look, the message that kind of sends is, hey, there's things that would need to be worked out for this to be a possibility. And so, you know, I think that, again, that low-hanging fruit versus sort of the things that aren't quite soup yet or may not ever become soup, I think is important to make that distinction. And I also appreciate the way that these are broken out, because I think it does give us some things that we can immediately work on and some things that we can continue to explore and figure out if and how we could tackle them. So I think that sort of, you know, that distinction in my mind makes a lot of sense.
Great, thank you, Representative. Appreciate that. Yeah, I think, you know, for anyone who wasn't closely involved, I think the example of AB 114 SB 100 from last session is a good example where, you know, the way it was introduced, there was a lot of opposition, frankly. You know, it did address a problem that people thought needed to be addressed in terms of additional regulatory oversight of PBMs and a number of other provisions in there. But to Representative Subek's point, it wasn't soup yet. And there was a lot of work that went into working with the various stakeholders to come up with some language that everyone basically could live with at the end of the day. And, you know, recognizing not everyone was 100% happy with it. Some people still thought it went too far. Others thought it went not far enough. But, you know, I think we're structuring these recommendations and policy options and structuring the report, just recognizing that that's how the policy making process works. So again, appreciate the perspective from the two of you. Brian, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I just had a question. You mentioned that y'all decided to present it in this format as recommendations rather than specific policy language or legislative language or specific operational details. And I just wondered, kind of what went into the decision making on that, and can we still feel confident that some of these recommendations are going to move forward, and who would likely kind of take up the torch on these and move them forward to that next stage?
Mm-hmm. So I'd say, it's kind of a two-track system. One would be, the governor and his staff, as he's working on putting together his budget that he'll introduce in kind of January, February timeframe. We've been in touch with them, just giving them a heads up about some of the things that we've been looking at will likely be included in the report. They have an interest in probably diving into some of those in more detail. And, we didn't want to be overly prescriptive in terms of telling them exactly how the legislative language needs to be structured. And that's why we want to keep it kind of general, but also have some examples of what other states have done or other model laws that they could look to as examples. And then the other track, again, being, what representatives mentioned, is the legislature looking at, what do they want to support from this report and move forward with. And again, the same way of thinking where, we don't want to be overly prescriptive to say, okay, if you're going to move forward with, specifically additional reporting around rebates in the supply chain, this is the exact language you have to use. We want to keep it more general. So, this is a general recommendation of something that, you should probably look at and consider, but how you actually want to structure that language, we would defer to them on how that would come together and what the details would be. Does that help, Brian?
Yeah, that's helpful. I just wanted to make sure that, we're taking this approach because we think that it gives these recommendations the best chance of moving forward. And it sounds like it does.
Yeah, I mean, that's the ultimate
and
goal.
Brian,
Go ahead.
Sorry, it's Tyler again. I would just say too, if there's, if you have either specific legislative language or there's something that anybody wants to work on, feel free to, speaking, I guess, for myself, but feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to work on certain things or have a discussion about it, and otherwise refer them to other members who of the legislature who I know maybe have been kind of have an interest in it or have been working on something similar, or feel free to use me as a resource too, moving forward.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would say, I don't know if everyone's had a chance to review all the comment letters yet, but I know a couple of the stakeholder groups have, put forward a specific recommended language that they would like to see around some proposals. So, that's the kind of thing that we'd like to see. Again, we'll provide kind of the foundation and the general structure, but then, working with the relevant stakeholder groups and others to build out those details is how we see it coming together. Okay. All right, if there aren't any other questions, why don't we dive in? Megan, can you advance to the next slide? All right. So this is what I'd refer to as kind of the tier one. So these are the ideas, and again, this is in draft form. What we hope to do today is to talk through it. Where there's agreement, great. Where people have some concerns or want some changes made, that's what we want to hear. So, we'll move quickly through the AB 114, SB 100 provisions. I think we've talked about those quite a bit. General support for those moving forward. Not sure what's going to happen, with the legislature, but I assume there will be activity around those items again, if not finishing this year, then going into next legislative session. So I don't think we need any more discussion around those items at this point. The second main bullet really reflects that, we've heard a lot, obviously, that there's just activity, there's things that we can't address at the state level. that to really get at a number of the issues when it comes to the high cost of prescription drugs would require federal action. So that second bullet just reflects a recommendation for elected officials at the state level to continue to stay engaged and work with the congressional delegation and others to address any of those issues that they think need to be addressed in terms of lowering the cost of prescription drugs from a federal perspective. So any questions on that one or comments? Okay. So the third main bullet, this comes out of, like I referenced there, out of the Pharmacy Cost Study Committee. We heard an overview, a summary of the work from that committee, I believe on the 22nd last month. And this is not, just to be clear, this is not the idea of a affordability or accountability board, the way we've talked about in other ways. We do have that listed in tier 2 later in the document, but this is really more reflective of the fact that as we did this work with the Pharmacy Cost Study Committee and really tried to coordinate with the different state agencies that purchase drugs in a way to try to leverage the purchasing power and find some savings, that we just found that an entity, an executive level entity or some type of entity that is solely focused on doing that work of coordinating with agencies as well as other public sector entities. And then frankly, as we say in the sub-bullet there, looking at other potential public-private partnerships. I think we've heard a lot about the Northwest Prescription Drug Consortium. And is there some way to either create something similar here in Wisconsin or to partner with the consortium? Sounds like they're looking for other states that they want to partner with. Also Civica RX, it sounds like they're continuing to work with states and other public sector entities around purchasing lower cost medications. So this bullet just reflects the need to have some type of entity to continue to look at what those potential partnerships could be, especially as the landscape continues to evolve, and then work with all the relevant stakeholders to implement whatever needs to be done to make this happen. Any questions on that? Okay, is everyone muted? No one can talk today? The next bullet, this comes out of the discussion, something that Dr. Goldrosen has brought up. I know Robin has talked about it as well, that Optum is doing. Not entirely sure what this looks like, but I do think, there was a general agreement that having some way for physicians and, other medical professionals who prescribe medication to have real-time information about a patient's pharmacy benefit in order to understand what the out-of-pocket cost exposure would be when prescribing medications would be helpful. So, I fully acknowledge this isn't something that is directly going to reduce the cost of prescription drugs, but I think, it seemed like there was a good discussion and general support for looking at, how does the state maybe enter into some public-private partnership or help support the creation of something that's kind of a larger scale. Dr. Goldrosen, any thoughts or comments on that?
I guess the only other thing would be that, for me, it's not just to allow us to take the out-of-pocket cost into consideration, but the total cost. So if the out-of-pocket cost of, 2 drugs, if an out-of-pocket cost for a patient is $25 versus $200, obviously we'd want to go to $25 out-of-pocket cost. But at the same time, if 2 drugs are available, they're each going to cost, say, $50 a month, and one has a total cost, though, to the insurance and the patient of $300 a month, and the other one has a cost of $1,200 a month, other things being relatively equal, we ought to be able to pick the lower cost. And we don't necessarily know the cost of comparative medications at the time. So in order to decrease the cost to everybody, it'd be nice to have the total cost as well.
So both the out-of-pocket cost and the total cost of the medication?
Right, those would be helpful, and I'm sure that's challenging at times because the total cost, isn't necessarily the list price, but takes into account many different factors. But, if we're gonna be able to choose wisely, we need to know what the total cost of, ideally, whether it's medications, whether it's tests that we might order, et cetera, what those costs are to the healthcare system and thus obviously to the population as a whole.
Okay. We can modify that to reflect what you just said.
Nathan, this is Robin Schumacher. Thank you for those comments, Dr. Goldrosen. I know that is something that we've heard, from other providers, from our consulting community. I know that is something that we're continuing to look at, including in, the programs that we have. So, that is something that we are working towards from an OptumRx perspective anyway. I can't speak for some of the other PBMs that have the same tools. But I do believe that is a very effective way of taking some meaningful and actionable steps towards, greater transparency for the providers to see the cost of prescription medications, for members to understand their costs and be able to evaluate cost differences between different medications that they may be prescribed and understand their benefits at a deeper level.
Yeah, thanks for that, Robin.
Thank you.
And I know Optum, others are doing good work in this space. I think this bullet is just an acknowledgement that, if there's a way for public sector support, again, some kind of public-private partnership, not sure entirely what that looks like, but something to help provide broader support for some of the work that Optum and others are doing.
I know we don't, this is Brian, I know we don't want to get too prescriptive, but, I know for our I think I'm speaking on behalf of our physicians, and Dr. Goldrosen, you can kind of chime in here too, but I think early on when we talked about this, we talked about the importance of integrating it within the EHR too, because if our physicians or their staff are supposed to go out to a separate tool online, for each different PBM, then it's not going to happen. So I don't know if we want to put that into this recommendation that it would be integrated within the electronic health record, but to me that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's pretty essential. We can't go out to every different insurer, every different PBM, whether it's done by the PBM or whether it's done by each and every private insurer, Medicaid, every Part D plan. Obviously, we can't be looking this up for every different company. So it has to be in front of us when we're making decisions.
Yeah, I think that EHR integration is critical. We can definitely add a reference to that, Brian.
This is Brian Stam. Does anybody know if Epic has that capability currently? And I only asked Epic because they're in our backyard. So.
They do have quite a bit of that availability. Yeah. I think different, different organizations will implement it or not implement it in different ways. But between Epic and I assume other EHRs, and they usually will, balance that information, and others may, weigh in on this, but off of things they get from SureScripts or other things they integrate with that have various information that insurance or PBMs feed into to get that information. So I think it's something that's available, but not necessarily widely in use or necessarily has all the data in it.
I know OptumRx is working with Epic as one of the EMRs to update. It kind of depends on whether they're cloud-based and or if some of those have to be updated, at a location specific, how quickly that can happen. But Epic is one that we've been working with.
Okay. All right, let's move on. So I'm sure there will be some comments on this one, and obviously we've talked about it quite a bit already, but establishing a copay cap for insulin, recognizing, the concerns that are expressed, especially from the payer community. However, the more we look into this, I do feel like keeping it focused and limited to insulin. And honestly, the more we also look into it in the commercial market, it really looks like a lot of plans are already voluntarily, reducing their copay for insulin down to $100 or less in a number of cases. So, I think we generally understand the concern, but I think in this specific example, we think it's important to have a copay cap on insulin. So I'll open it up. Love to hear feedback.
Hey, Nathan, this is Brent. I'm wondering if we can clarify though that it's the preferred insulin products on the formulary versus all insulin products, because we still want to have the manufacturers have some ability to compete on price and be in a preferred position versus everything that's labeled as insulin being covered at a max copay. But to meet and think in having a lower copay insulin available, at least limiting it to the preferred insulin products on the formulary, I think would be still meet the goal.
Okay, thanks, Brent. Any other feedback on that?
Nathan, it's Janet. Just want to say again that I am in favor of this, and I think that it also, besides the insulin, sorry, not stating it well. I think it could decrease other things besides drug costs. It also could decrease ER visits if diabetics are taking their insulin as prescribed. That's my only point.
Thanks, Janet. Appreciate it. Yeah, and I know we did in a number of the comment letters, others did express support for this as well.
Nathan, quick question, actually 2 questions.
Go ahead, Josh.
First off, you mentioned 100. Is that going to be the recommendation? Is a $100 cap? And then second, I understand that multiple groups have asked for this. I understand some people are in favor. Is there a reason why we're picking insulin over several other classes where individuals have high out-of-pocket costs? Which is really one of my main concerns, is that we're picking insulin, but other people actually are worse off from an out-of-pocket cost standpoint.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. And I know, the concern has been raised about, picking winners and losers anytime you put copay caps in place. But, there's also been a lot of work and a lot of research around insulin in particular. It's just something that we've heard a lot about, specifically, both in presentations and in comment letters and other conversations. So frankly, Josh, because it's something that is very front of mind for a lot of people, because there is a lot of effort around it, a lot of support, a lot of advocacy push, that's where the support for the insulin cap, I think that's what's driving that. I mean, if we want to talk about copay caps for other things, should we do a bunch of them? I'm kidding.
Yeah, and that's my concern is, where does it end? We start with insulin, and now the next group, we just heard from an MS patient, and at some point it does start to affect the cost of premium and cost share for other individuals. And I mean, we know from the groups that are members of ours, this has very little impact, but the precedent that it sets is very concerning. And then has there been discussion on what the number is?
I think we would keep that open-ended. I know the legislation, or I should say, I believe the legislation last session was 100, but I don't think we'd put a specific dollar number in there. Probably leave that up to, the governor and legislators to determine what that would be. I understand your point. I've worked in the legislative arena. I understand how advocacy campaigns build over time. I will say the conversation around insulin and the high cost and the fact that that cost isn't necessarily justified when you look at market forces. is something that's been building for a long time. And I think that's, it's just been very front of mind for a lot of people and has got a lot of attention. So, I'm very aware of what you're saying, and, might be conversations about other issues down the road. But I think this is one where, again, just a lot of discussion around it, a lot of attention on it.
This is Brian Stam. I'm just going to jump in with two things, and just to discuss this on the both short term and long term. So short term, I completely understand that insulin a copay cap on this is helpful for a consumer. But one thing that we need to remember is that the cost of the drug has not changed in itself, and so it's just kind of divvying up who's going to pay for what on this. And unfortunately, just the way that this works on the insurance side is that eventually the consumer will end up just paying a higher premium in the long run, unless, like Janet had said, we see a drastic shift in behavior on treatment of diabetes. So if we actually reduce the burden of diabetes overall, then we could actually see a lower premium. But if all we're doing is shifting the cost, long term, the individual, the consumer may or may not be better off. And second off, if we impose what's essentially like a price ceiling, we may also be artificially imposing a price floor on this. So if there was some sort of innovation in the market, your $100 price cap essentially now becomes the lowest point that anyone would ever sell something at. So let's say, tomorrow Brian Stam Industries invents a new insulin that only costs $3. I'm going to market it at $100 now because that's what the cap is. Just putting that out there.
Yeah.
Hey, Nathan, this is Lisa from AARP, and I guess I just want to weigh in and say, I'm really pleased to see this recommendation in there. And I think one of the reasons it's important for consumers is because we have so many people who are struggling with diabetes and who are using insulin, and we're seeing that people aren't taking it. And I think just the sheer numbers, and particularly of our population, people age 50 plus, but of course we know it impacts people of all ages. This is going to provide some immediate relief. It might not be the end all be all to everything, and there may be things down the road that have to be tweaked. But I think from what we've seen, the stories that even this task force has heard, it is a great step, and I'm really pleased to see this recommendation in that first tier. So thank you for that.
I also just want to add too that the state of Colorado actually imposed this, and if we're talking about looking at other states and what kind of initiatives they took, the same complaint kind of came up that there was going to be a lot of cost shifting and a lot of it was going to raise premiums, and what they found after a year posing their insulin cap is there are actually not premium hikes. And when the Office of Insurance Commissioner actually came back to those insurance companies and said, what would you say, if any, attributed to any rises in premiums, and specifically to insulin? And they said that the impact on the insulin cap was negligible on their on the way that they had set premiums. So I think it is, and I understand that that was only after a year, and that could be, I think what Brian said is very valid, that over time, especially when the price potentially could change, it could have an effect. But I think for right now, when we're talking about immediate relief and talking about, that there might be other expenses that are being decreased, I would see this really as a long-term win as well.
It's Mike Goldrosen. I got a few questions. One, so would this copay cap apply to everybody purchasing insulin within the state, or does it exclude Medicare Part D plans, for example? A second question I have is maybe for Ian, who's looked at what they did in Colorado or others. Do we know where this has been applied in other states? If it shifts medication use for diabetics to insulin and away from other options in type 2 diabetics where there are other options, although they may be, more expensive. And now with this cap may be considerably more expensive. That's a second question. And I guess my third is, and I don't think this will be an issue where it's, some states are doing this, but when you get to a national, let's say most states apply a copay cap, do others on the task force think that's going to cause a dramatic rise in the cost of insulins when there's a complete separation between what people pay and what the cost of the medication is?
So your first question, Dr. Golder, was, and it would apply to all the commercially insured plans in the state. But I'll open it up if others want to respond to the second part of that question. Lisa, Ian, anyone else?
I could weigh in on the second question, which is that I don't want to attribute the consumer behaviors of insured patients to those of my uninsured patients, but that treatment shift that you are talking about is something that is very common. We are having to essentially use your treatment on the patients once we're able to get them stabilized on insulin. We see that pretty common, that we're having to take off metformin, other drugs, when we finally get them hooked up on their preferred insulin, or the one that our doctor feels is necessary.
Okay, thanks, Ian. I think, Peter, you have some responses? Peter, are you there?
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my speak. Just from perspective of what else has been happening around the country, then Ian touched on Colorado, but as far as the copay cap at $100, there's been multiple proposals throughout the country. Some have placed that price at $75, $50. It's just whatever the state decided that they wanted to be on. And then in places, most states have only had this policy apply to state-sponsored health insurance plans, not all commercial health insurance plans. So that's something that we should take into consideration if this is going to be included in the recommendations. Just because obviously it can't apply to Medicaid, it can't apply to Medicare, and then with the state mandating, if a state were to mandate this, they would only, I think, in most states, I think, have followed this model that it would only apply to the state-sponsored health insurance plans.
Ethan, this is Robin. I would agree that the public and private employers and unions should be able to determine what their copay and coinsurance models should be for their plans and make that best decision so that they can remain competitive. So I echo many of the comments that have already been made. It's not really getting at the root cause for the primary cause of the high cost of the rise in medications. So, I maybe for a state plan, this would be a model that would work, but not for private insurers and employers.
Okay. Any other comments on this one?
Hey, this is Janet. So can it be for private? I mean, does the legislature or whoever would have to make this happen, can they make it for private insurers, or can it only be for state sponsor?
They could make it for state regulated commercial insurers. So not for, self-funded plans.
Right. Okay. I understand.
Okay. Well, we'll collect these comments, and look at how, we want to characterize this, maybe send a follow-up email for any additional feedback. But really appreciate all the feedback on this one. I know there's some strong opinions and strong feelings about this on both sides of it. And, I recognize that there's, validity to the arguments on both sides. And you know, ultimately, ultimately this comes back in a way to something I've talked with a number of you about, you know, both with this group, but then privately is, you know, this issue of, are we looking at reducing prescription drug prices on a macro scale and really having an impact on the overall healthcare system? Or are we looking at more of a micro scale, and how do we maybe put some measures in place that, you know, maybe we acknowledge will have additional costs to the system overall, but will help people at an individual level, you know, keep their costs down and afford medication. And, you know, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, those two ideas are in opposition. And I think it's something, you know, we've touched on that a number of times through our meetings and our discussions. And, you know, as we continue to look at these policy options that have surfaced, I think, you know, it's really a number of these do fall into one of those two buckets, and it's hard to know what the right answer is. And like I said, oftentimes they're in opposition to each other. So we will, for the sake of time, we'll move on here. But again, appreciate the comments and the feedback on this one. So this next issue, you know, is more of the kind of general recognition that the need for more, there's more need for transparency and probably reporting in terms of the supply chain entities. You know, and again, it's kind of acknowledgement that transparency reporting in and of itself doesn't bring down drug costs. However, because the system is so opaque, because there's so many unknowns about how the dollars flow, you know, again, through a number of conversations, I think people have acknowledged that having more information could be helpful in terms of taking a step forward for future policies to be implemented or take additional actions down the road, being armed with that additional information. So again, we kept that bullet in the description, you know, fairly general and high level, but, you know, I'd love to get feedback on any specific transparency initiatives, reporting requirements that people would like to see included or not included. And, you know, I want to keep this discussion fairly limited. I know we could talk for the rest of the time just about this. But if people want to share some comments, and then obviously if there's additional information you want to share, again, please submit comment letters so we can have that information collected. So I'll open it up. Any feedback, any comments, any thoughts?
This is Brian Stam. I would just say that with any sort of reporting like this, it's also important to have it be audited by some sort of independent third party to verify the results. That goes without saying for pretty much any sort of vendor agreement or any sort of contract that you have like this. It's always best to get a independent source to make sure everything went as perfectly as it was supposed to.
Gotcha. Thanks, Brian. Appreciate that.
Nathan, this is Tony. I think the other thing to remember when we talk about any type of additional reporting, we make sure that we are not inadvertently putting undue stress on parts of the pharmacy supply chain that are already maybe understaffed. And then additional reporting might cause the need for them to make cuts somewhere else. That's going to impact patient care. So anytime we talk about reporting in any venue, not that I don't think this is a good idea. I think we just have to be very careful with how that comes across to all of the different pharmacy supply chain stakeholders.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, Tony. I know it's always a balance, additional workload and, you know, everything that comes with that. You know, I think that's where any guidance or additional feedback people could provide about, you know, I think there's a general acknowledgement that more transparency would be beneficial. But then, you know, the question becomes, what does that look like? And how do we require that, you know, in a way that we can get some meaningful information without, Tony, to your point, putting too much of a burden on any companies or any stakeholders.
Or opening windows for other entities to require reporting because of a precedent that's set. That doesn't fall in line with the with the impact of what this wants to accomplish.
Good. Mm-hmm. Super. Yep, that's a good point.
Hey, this is Lisa. I always struggle with this particular issue because of what that reporting would look like. And I guess that to me, the question that needs to be asked if we are to develop something that was an actual proposal is what would actually impact prices? Because I think that there is an inherent logic to the idea that more transparency is a good thing. We know very little sort of as the public about drug pricing. If more is known, then it kind of puts whoever it is in that supply chain in a position where they need to start being more accountable, and accountability is a good thing. But I don't know what those points are. And I think that, you know, I've done a fair amount of reading over the last few weeks, just trying to figure out what other states did that have looked at this. And I'm not sure that I ever, and there are folks who have more expertise in this arena on this call who might have better ideas than I would anyway. But I think that one of the things that we need to figure out, or whoever puts together this proposal would need to determine, is what are those reporting points? What is it that would actually, that would be reported in a way, and how would it be meaningful? And, you know, sort of to whom is it reported? How is that shared in a way that actually has a meaningful impact? And I really struggle to wrap my head around that a little bit. I don't know if there's anyone who can address sort of more specifically what that might look like.
I would just hold up as an example, the Wisconsin Hospital Association, you know, I think maybe it started out as voluntary, but, you know, now it requires mandatory submission of data from member hospitals to the Wisconsin Hospital Association. And so for years, we've had the Wisconsin Hospital Association Price Point website and Checkpoint websites, both of which are extremely transparent and are held up as a model across the country of hospital price transparency. So I think the societies, you know, the professional societies that represent each of the different sectors of the supply chain might be able to play a role in transparency.
That's really helpful. And I think the Hospital Association's a great example there of where those kinds of partnerships of working together work really well. Out of curiosity, and I probably should know the answer to this, but has anybody taken a look, and has it been able to be determined over time whether that checkpoint and price point system has actually impacted either cost of care or what folks are paying for hospital care? Any sense of that at this point?
I don't know the answer to that one specifically. I can certainly ask the folks at WHA if they have any data on that, but I can tell you just as an example, you know, our hospital, we look at the data on price point to help us set competitive prices in the market. And so, you know, for example, you know, we haven't had a price increase over 3% in over 10 years. And it's directly related to being able to have that data at our fingertips and know what we need to price at to be competitive. So I think it helps.
Thank you, Brian. That's really helpful to know.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Representative Stuback. Good questions. You know, and I think this is one where we can continue to look at what other states are doing, what other organizations, you know, maybe NASHB or maybe some of the other national associations are what they're putting out there in terms of potential model laws, and see how we can leverage some of the knowledge and expertise from, you know, what's happening elsewhere. Robin, did you have a comment?
Oh, yeah, sorry, Nathan. I agree with many of the comments that have been made. It'd be helpful to understand how this would really help the state manage drug costs. I think from the PBM perspective, there's concerns about, you know, having a data dump of information, how that would be used, who would have access to that information, and how, you know, for instance, a drug manufacturer would use that information in determining how we might be contracted with another drug manufacturer for rebate purposes, et cetera. And, you know, from the way that we operate with the employers that we work with, we do allow access and full transparency to those rebate contracts, depending on what contract is in place. So there is transparency between the PBM and the clients already in those situations where the client has requested it, and it's available. So I really would like to help further understand how this would help the state manage drug costs and really have a true impact. Thank you.
Yeah, and Robin, I guess I don't have a direct answer to your question at this point, other than to say, that there's, again, a general acknowledgement that, there's a general acknowledgement that drug costs are very high in many cases. And there's, support from policymakers to take some action to address that. But the more we look into that, the more we realize that the system is so opaque and there's such a lack of information that there's not enough good information to take any action from a policymaking standpoint. So I don't have a direct response in terms of, if A, then B, but it's more, getting additional information, collecting the data to inform better policymaking to address some of these situations that policymakers are trying to address. I think that's what we're trying to get at with this. I don't know, Representative Subek or Pagel, from a legislative standpoint, if you have any thoughts on it.
Like Representative Subek, a lot of times in theory, the reporting and transparency things are good in theory, but if it's going to be a document that's just put out and then shelved somewhere, that's not, I think, the intent of what we're here for. So if we can figure out a way, whether it's like OCI to, I know Ian had mentioned different studies that they had done, on the cap, the impacts of the capping of insulin prices or whatever. If I don't know if it's OCI or if somebody can turn them into a document where we can actually, decipher what's working, what's not, where we can make improvements moving forward. I think that should be the goal.
Appreciate that. Okay, Alan, you have a comment, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I think this is extremely important, transparency, to be able to really understand where there's opportunity to lower the cost of prescription drugs to the end user, which then begs the question, who would be responsible for doing this, sustaining it, funding it, and so forth, which to me then kind of speaks to better support for a drug affordability review board to be able to at least put in place the structure and ability to measure drug cost and define opportunities where we can lower the cost of prescription drugs. So I just some comments on that would be appreciated, but I would also stress that from my viewpoint, we really need to make some inroads into lowering the cost of prescription drugs. What I've seen and heard so far, quite frankly, I think is going to be limited or minimal. I think if we actually all banded together, all parties, and basically work collaboratively and trying to keep all stakeholders whole, there might be opportunities to actually use a different model and pilot and be able to lower the cost of prescription drugs substantially and healthcare costs. And again, I emphasize again, with the intent of keeping everybody whole, perhaps that's an option. And that goes to that transparency concept with the affordability and review board. Just my thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Okay. Well, we will collected everyone's comments and thoughts on that one, and we will take that under advisement here as we're building this out. Megan, can you advance to the next slide? This is one that I know came up in a few conversations. Acknowledgement that The PSAOs are, similar to PBMs, don't have a lot of regulatory oversight at this point. And I know there was support expressed for having some type of, whether it's licensure or registration as mentioned here, just some regulatory oversight to better understand the role of PSAOs and ensure that they're abiding by good business practices as supply chain participants. So open it up on this one. We don't have anyone representing the PSAOs directly, so I guess we'll pick on them not being around the table right now. Okay, hearing none, we'll move on. So this next one came up from our friends at DACAP and DOJ, really building on the work that they're currently doing and just an acknowledgement that a lot of good work is happening there, making sure that consumers are being protected, and if there are bad business practices, that actions are being taken against those entities. And again, just acknowledgement that more resources could be helpful and could provide additional support for the work that they're currently doing. So Laura or Lara, do you have any comments on that?
No, I think you summarized it well. Just the more staff we have, the more ability we're able to protect consumers through our consumer protection and antitrust work, specifically related to prescription drug prices.
Great, thank you. Laura, did you have anything? I thought I saw you.
I second Laura's position on this. I think that this is a good recommendation and needed resources for further enforcement. So we appreciate the inclusion.
Okay. Again, fairly straightforward, but very important work that DACAP and DOJ are doing. So thank you both, appreciate that. So we'll move on to the free and charitable clinics and pharmacies. I know we had a really good presentation. There was a lot of interest coming out of that presentation. Again, acknowledge at the outset that we're not, from the macro standpoint, obviously, these measures don't bring down the cost of healthcare for the system overall, but I think they can have a real meaningful impact on the micro and the individual level. So, these are 4 items that that surfaced when we were talking about the free and charitable clinics and pharmacies. Obviously, first one, additional state funding. I just, put kind of a note there that there was potential interest in looking at having settlement funds from the any pharmaceutical industry lawsuits be directed for as a funding source. I know there's additional work that's needed there, and not ready to say that's definitely something we want to do, but just included that as a note, as a potential option for consideration. The next one, I know I forwarded you, or Jennifer forwarded you, the proposal we received to create a centralized repository for donated medications, including a real-time inventory coordination. So that's one thing I know that came out of the discussion we had with FCCs, and actually had a follow-up discussion and looking at some work that is happening in Iowa and other states in terms of just doing a better job of really coordinating. Right now, the free and charitable clinic network is fairly disaggregated, not very coordinated. And what can we do to improve that coordination and create a more centralized location with real-time inventory management to make sure that those donated medications are being transferred to the communities where they're needed most. And I'll run through these quick, and then Yolanda and Ian, I'll turn it over to you if you have any comments based on all of these, but I'll just touch on them quick. Another one coming out of this conversation that we had with some folks in Iowa is allowing the interstate transferability of donated medications, so that medication, as long as it's deemed safe and approved and follows all the proper protections and protocols that it can be transferred from a different state to be used here in Wisconsin. Obviously, that's important, especially for border communities. So that's something that we want to look at as well. And then something I believe Yolanda had brought up is allowing a percentage of continuing education requirements for pharmacists be dedicated toward volunteerism as a way to help with additional staff support for free and charitable clinics, allowing pharmacists to earn some of their continuing ed credits by volunteering at those clinics. So Ian, Yolanda, I'll open it up to you first. Do you have anything else you want to add? Any follow-up on these items?
Yolanda, would you like to talk about the repository or the just kind of central database, just because you obviously have worked very closely with the free and charitable clinics on trying to make this a priority?
Sure. The idea would be to, since all the drug repository sites actually are receiving medications, we're receiving medications that we don't necessarily need, but perhaps within our network, there may be folks that could use them. And so to cut down on the waste and to really distribute the medications where they would be needed and could be used, we're looking to create some type of online real-time inventory database where we could, as members, see what medications each other has and then create basically invoices or manifests to transfer meds from one site to another to get the medications to the patients that are in need of them. And then also we would serve as all of the pharmacies that are in the community would know that we are pharmacies that could be donated to, whether they be in the community or hospital sites that are repositories, so that those medications can be received and then be routed to folks that are in need of them. So there are several systems across the country that are doing this very well. Iowa is one example. There's also one called Serum in California that is doing this work. So we're just hoping that that's one thing that we can get going with this state to kind of coordinate and make this system more efficient so that we can provide the safety net, which will actually save all of us money in the long run, so that we can take care of the folks that are most in need that others would otherwise not be able to help.
Yeah, and I think I think I want to echo everything that Yolanda said. I think that free and charitable clinics do provide value to the safety net, and I think Nathan said it best. It is a micro level solution, but it's for those who are the most vulnerable right now. And if we are getting our patients healthier and actually delivering the necessary treatments for them, we will see savings in the long term. Because one of the biggest complaints I get from our area partners is how much charitable care they're constantly spending, and we're able to kind of prove to them that we can actually detail this many number of patients who we noticed that they went to the emergency room this amount of times last year, and then they are not going to the emergency room this many times this year. And it's so there is a difference by actually just providing those medications for the system as a whole, which is why the funding mechanism is very important. The example I like to give is Yolanda and I, again, we do kind of work together in exchanging medications with one another. But recently I had a type of insulin that I had actually exchanged with another clinic up in Wausau. And the issue became that we then needed that insulin at a later date. Well, the patient needed it immediately. We weren't able to get it through PAP for that patient, so I had to go out and use our grant funds and spend $2,000 on insulin just for that one patient, because we wanted to make sure they had a continuity of care. So I think that those are really, I think all of those things work to make sure that free and charitable clinics have enough volunteers, they have enough funding, but also that they're going to be efficient in terms of their allocation as well through a central repository.
And we want to just really be able to coordinate with all of the for-profit pharmacies that are out there to be able to be a referral, a place where you can refer folks that you can't help.
Yeah, Nathan, can I jump in on this one too?
Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
So, I mean, I worked for Walgreens for 20 years, and this was one of the things that, you know, they did a really good job at getting the medication disposal kiosks up and running. But what that eliminates is people's ability to take the medication that is unused and put it to good use. So I think education on this one is a huge thing. I think there's so much opportunity to, if all, you know, partners are working together to educate patients on, if it's this type of medication, it can go into the disposal kiosk. If it's an unused medication that can help others, it goes here. And there's a better way to communicate that. I think it would go a long way to helping out way more individuals. I think the centralized database also, and just making the process, because we run a repository at Vivint as well, and it's not the easiest thing to manage and to keep going when, to their point, when you need to get something that maybe isn't in your repository, you need to get something to a patient, you're limited with options. But if somebody else in the network would have the ability to get you that medication, or you could get medication to somebody who needs it, I think you'd be able to help a lot. So this one, I'm a huge proponent of, and I think it would help quite a few people and be really something that would not cost a ton of money at all to do.
Great. Thank you. Thank all three of you. Really appreciate that overview, and you know, I think you make a really strong argument why you know these are important policy considerations to advance. So if I don't hear any other comments, I think we'll move on here to the last item. So we're going to touch the third rail here and talk about 340B a little bit, but this is, you know, obviously an important issue and something that, you know, have it worded in a way here that tried to reflect prior conversations that we've had, but also recognizing that this one is up for kind of debate in terms of whether we feel that it is, you know, how much support there is for doing something like this. Because, you know, I also recognize we probably should have included critical access hospitals in the reference here, but you know, again, I think this is one where there's not a, I understand the argument with 340B and reimbursing at the level that the 340B drugs are purchased at, but I think for FQHCs, you know, Ryan White programs, critical access hospitals, the funding that they are bringing in as a result of the 340B program is really critical for supporting other services that they're providing for the communities that they serve. And I think we all recognize that people getting access to proper care obviously is important for overall health, which obviously brings and keeps healthcare costs down, including prescription drug costs. So, you know, what we're trying to get at with this recommendation is, you know, is there something that we can acknowledge that could be done to ensure that these organizations are able to continue using that additional revenue and that additional funding support to make sure that they are able to provide those critical community services, and that the populations they serve continue to receive access to the care that they rely on from these organizations. So, you know, I'll open it up. You know, Tony, maybe I'll kick it over to you if you just want to say a couple words first and go from there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Nathan. I think what you hit on is spot on. You know, the ability to have other services and programs that these patients never would be able to utilize: dental, behavioral health, medical, prescription services. It all lies on the ability of us to be able to use the 340B program the way it was designed to do, and that's what we do. We have a ton of oversight that we have on ourselves to make sure that we're always compliant and adherent with what we're doing within the program, and that includes the duplicate discount checks and making sure we're covering out the Medicaids and different things. You know, one of the responses that were sent in had something in that said that some of this would not impact drug pricing for patients, so it should be taken out. That's just false and wrong, because the reason why we can do the things we do for the patients is because of the program and the reimbursement that we get and the savings that we're able to reinvest. So I appreciate the conversations back and forth on this. And I know that there's been a lot of different views on this, but this truly is what allows us to do what we can do for our patients.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate that. And I think that really came through in the Vivint presentation that we heard. Brian Stevens, did you want to say anything about it too? I know obviously this is something that you've touched on with the work that Door County Medical is doing.
Yeah, I would just echo what Tony said, and you know, obviously would like to see critical access hospitals included in the language if this is intended to kind of protect entities who really rely on 340B discounts, and so, you know, if that's possible, would like to see that, but certainly appreciate the sentiment, and I think, Nathan, obviously you and your team understand the importance of the program for us. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Brian, appreciate that. So I'll open it up. Any other comments about this? I know obviously we've talked a lot about it. There are a lot of strong feelings and opinions around this program. You know, and again, I'm open to kind of revising a recommendation here, but I think everyone understands what we're trying to get at without being too broad at the same time.
So Nathan, this is Brent. I guess a couple of questions that I want to make sure I understand with what we're getting at here. I believe like Walgreens and CVS are the largest 340B contract pharmacies today. And they operate very differently than the example that Tony gave and the Vivint presentation as well. So I'm wondering, is the idea here to expand this to all 340B contract pharmacies, or limiting it to a subset that are really reinvesting the savings to do the programs that Tony mentioned? And then my second part of that question, does this language also then put some requirements on the entity that they're actually using the savings to provide those services versus using those savings to drive their bottom line?
Good questions, Brent. I would say, I think we're trying to get at the latter point you made, you know, really supporting the entities that are utilizing the program the way it was intended, and using the cost savings from the program to fund critical community-based programs and other programs that are focused on helping provide critical healthcare support for the populations they serve.
And just if I can jump in, the covered entities, Brent, are required to do that already. So that's part of the process that we already go through. The contract pharmacies, they're not, I mean, all of the risk falls on the covered entities to make sure that everything is being done appropriately. The contract pharmacies are just an outlet for the covered entities when they don't have their own pharmacies to be able to capitalize on the savings. And then the the contract pharmacies, you know, right, wrong, or indifferent, they're able to have that some level of, you know, because there's things that they have to put in place that do cost extra money, but there's probably some room for that. But the risk is already on the covered entity, and that reporting, it already exists within all the covered entities. If you aren't doing the reporting and you're not showing it and you're audited, you will get kicked out of the program very quickly.
No, I understand that, Tony, that the covered entity is responsible for all of the reporting and the 340B compliance. That doesn't necessarily mean, unless my experience has been, that doesn't necessarily mean the covered entity is using all of those dollars to then go back directly into patient care. Those dollars sometimes get directed into other areas. is some of the stuff that I've seen. Even though that program is fully compliant, the spread that's being generated, it can be used to fund different items. My concern with this one is that commercial payers end up funding this. And because when a commercial payer uses a 340B pharmacy, that claim is no longer eligible for rebate discounts and is paying as if it's a full freight product, which is not only generating a ton of spread, it's increasing the cost to all the commercial clients that use that. And that cost is being used then to fund this program. I think it's a struggle for me to understand why a commercial payer should have to pay so much more to utilize a 340B entity. I understand there's good services being provided and we want to protect those. So I'm trying to figure out what the right balance to that is. But it does have a significant impact in the cost of the commercial payers that end up using a 340B pharmacy, because specifically all of those claims no longer generate a rebate. Once that claim, because there can't be double dipping, so the 340B claim does not generate a rebate, which increases the cost to the plan.
To that point though, Brent, you're not paying more. So if the 340B program, in essence, didn't exist, you still would be paying the same amount. However, you would be collecting on the rebate and getting the benefit. In essence, the current entities are utilizing the savings to reinvest. So it's just putting that, and I would argue that that money is being put directly into the patients, probably faster and easier than with potentially the way you're discussing it. So, and I know that you guys do things differently, and I appreciate how you guys do things, but I think we have to be careful when we say that it costs more money, because that's not true either.
Well, so I don't want to go too far onto this, but just to be really clear, so I'll use the case of the employee trust funds, ETF. If an ETF member gets insulin at a 340B pharmacy, that increases the cost of the insulin by 50 to 60% because they're no longer eligible for the rebate discount, of which 100% of that is going to the payer. That individual patient is still paying their copay and has no benefit from the 340B program itself. It's the other patients downstream that would get some benefit. But it does directly increase the cost of every claim to the state for rebated products that use the program. So it doesn't impact the acquisition cost or the reimbursement cost. We would reimburse both pharmacies the same, but if one's using a non-340B pharmacy and the other one isn't, for those highly rebated products, it's a significant increase in net cost to the payers.
So and again, I think it's just a matter of knowing where and when the savings is being pushed back to the patients versus pushed somewhere else. And I think that's your point. And I agree.
So Brent, let me ask, and I don't want to, belabor this. We've talked about this a lot, but, is it the concern that you're speaking to, and I fully understand what you're saying, has it been heightened, or is it a new concern in recent years? I mean, the 340B program has been around a while. The idea of how it impacts rebates and, the impact on cost. I mean, these aren't new things, right? I mean, I guess if there's an acknowledgement that certain entities like FQHCs, Ryan White programs are utilizing the program the way it was intended to be utilized, then, is it just a general concern with the program overall, or is there some newer development that is causing concern?
The newer development is just the massive expansion of 340B. It used to be more of a covered entity to their individual pharmacy or a covered entity to one specific contract pharmacy. Now it's one to many, and it is impacting a significant percentage of the claims that are just growing and growing from a 340B perspective. And as more pharmacies do 340B inventory, manufacturers are definitely looking and scrubbing those claims much more aggressively. And we even heard that in the Vivint presentation, that they're looking very carefully at doing that so the manufacturers aren't paying the 340B price and paying the rebate to the commercial payers. So it's just continued to grow. And again, there's some groups, like Tony's group does a great job of doing exactly what the intent is. So it's a little bit difficult to have the conversation because, yeah, I agree, they're doing a lot of really good things. But it is going to continue to impact the payers. And if the health plans and PBMs can't negotiate with these 340B pharmacies to share some of that savings with the actual payers, things could just get out of whack. And I'm trying to make sure that we don't create a situation where it gets too out of balance.
Yeah, I fully appreciate that, and I think we've heard that there's, I think most people who pay attention to the program generally feel that it's probably being used in ways that it wasn't intended to, and I think, what we're trying to get at with this, policy proposal is how do we I guess, is there anything we can do at the state level? And if there is, what can we do to limit it and refocus the program in a way that is ensuring that, it's being used in the way that it was intended by the entities that were intended to benefit from it, and not, to the point you're making.
And I'm completely supportive of that. I'm just worried the language here it's maybe a little bit too broad, and it's going to be kind of that next level underneath to get something that does exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. And, again, I know we've talked about this, but any states that we should look at, is there any language out there that you feel like, yeah, they really did it right, or they're on the right path?
I'm not aware of anything, Nathan, sorry.
Okay. And Tony, I know you did offer some language before, so we'll take a look at that again.
Yeah, and the key is the way this is worded is actually almost exactly how the intent of the program was worded in federal statute. And what I think we're trying to get at here is what we've seen is an inability to do this because of some of the things like the discriminatory reimbursements or the different payer structures. So that's why it's even necessary. I mean, this wasn't necessary before that was happening with the PBMs because it just wasn't an issue. So that's why there needs to be something here.
And I think that you nailed it, Tony. It's become an issue because it has become so big and has impacted the cost of commercial payers, so that the response has been, all right, do we want to change the networks, change some requirements because of the dollars that are being lost and the cost that's being increased we're kind of in this cycle now, right? The response was, all right, well, payers are going to push back, and now they've pushed back, and now then it's had an impact on clinics like yours. So that's kind of where we're at in the cycle.
Agree.
Yeah, and I guess, with this being a governor's task force, now the public policy making arena is looking at it saying, okay, is there something we can do from this perspective, understanding this kind of push and pull that's been happening in the market, you just mentioned. So, Peter, you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think from the manufacturer perspective, a lot of has been said that I agree with. I think the program has grown far beyond what it was ever intended to be. I mean, there's, 15 years ago, there was a little over 200 340B hospitals, and now there's 2,500 and 63,000 contract pharmacies. So pharma and the industry's position has always been very supportive of the 340B program with looking at the guardrails, doing proper audits. But I think I don't know what can be done from a state perspective, and obviously there's people on this call way smarter than me that probably have a good idea, but if at the very least, maybe there's something, if the governor wants to recommend something along 340B, maybe encourage Congress to revisit the numerous reports that the Government Accountability Office, the Inspector General at HHS, I think there's even been hearings at House Energy and Commerce Committee and probably Senate Finance Committee maybe, or Senate Health Committee. They've all looked at proposals to try and review the program to see if it's actually benefiting patients, if it's actually doing what it was supposed to do, if the proper benchmarks for charity care for these entities were being met, all that whole thing. So maybe at the very least, there's sort of an encouragement to the congressional delegation to continue the conversation with those various entities at the federal level.
Yeah, thanks for that, Peter. Appreciate it. You know, and I think we fully acknowledge there might not be anything at the state level. You know, it might just be saying, okay, feds, you need to look at this. I think, you know, we just wanted to include something to reflect that it's worth looking at, and especially, you know, Tony, I know you did send us some state language that, you know, since there are other states that are looking at it, to at least say, you know, okay, can we, is there something we should consider doing here as well? Alan, you have a comment, go ahead.
Yeah, just to color it a little differently, saying there's two sides to every coin. On the one side, what Tony is saying and what I have read and experienced in some communities, wonderful use of 340B funds. I like the story of the administrator of a hospital in Kansas that for their shrinking rural population that is underserved, develops a wonderful OB-GYN department and delivery department and supportive services. Excellent use of 340B. In addition, hospitals that are challenged being financially viable because their disproportionate share should use 340B to support programs. But then on the other side of the coin, what Brent is saying is very true. And we can speak forever about this contract pharmacy model and how some provider systems, the other side of the coin, are extracting huge amounts of profits, and those are not being passed through to certain areas where they are needed. And then we have the challenge that Brent alluded to, whereby which now those claims no longer qualify for rebates. And it's not like they never did. It's now that pharma is being more diligent, and you've seen recently actions by pharma requesting all those claims from contract pharmacies, restricting number of contract pharmacies to one for disproportionate share by one manufacturer and so forth. So the dynamic of this is changing. At the very least, this should be reworded to reinvest savings appropriately, making sure that 340B operates as intended, but also to bring forth transparency as to where 340B is actually working and to what degree, and we should be able to bring that forth so it's visible to the public where it is that 340B is not serving our members or the public. And I will just give two examples for people with high deductible health plan or low income. Why wouldn't we pass through discounts to those people? I'm still befuddled with that. I don't understand that at all.
Thanks for that, Alan. We appreciate it. And we are, just so everyone's aware, we are taking notes. We have staff taking notes on what everyone is saying, and we'll be, you know, revising the document and the recommendations based on the comments and the discussion today. So don't think that I'm just sitting here not doing anything with my hands. But, so we appreciate that. Yeah, well, we'll go back. We'll, you know, consider there a way to reword this. You know, maybe take a little closer look at what those other states are doing, and think about how we can maybe more accurately reflect what we're trying to get at here.
This is Brian Stam. Just one last question here on this topic. It appears that there's already, you know, federal auditing requirements on this program. And I'm wondering, are we looking to just amplify the support for those auditing requirements? I say that because it seems like there are plenty of organizations that are using this completely appropriately, and then we fear that there are some organizations that are using this inappropriately. And if there are some sort of hard evidence or clear suspicion that there is inappropriate use of the program going on, is there an ability for the state or for someone within the state to suggest an audit with that organization in question? Because if there's already a process and a framework for it, I don't know if we're just adding more cooks into the kitchen on this rather than just funneling people to the correct area. I'm just throwing that out as a question to the group because I don't know.
Yeah, and I'll turn it over. I don't have I don't know the details of the federal auditing process, so I don't know if Tony or Brian, Stephen, someone wants to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, Brian, I kind of agree with you. I mean, there is a very robust auditing process. It's actually one of the more detailed audits that we've been involved in the last couple of years. HRSA came in and did a kind of a week-long audit on our activities and how we use the funds, and the making sure we aren't, double dipping on the discounts and all those sorts of things. And so, I kind of agree with you. I think if anything, maybe you're asking the auditors to look at specific situations or something like that, but there is definitely a robust audit mechanism already in place.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. And we've actually helped other entities who don't have the safeguards in place like we have in place to actually do this the right way. So this is a huge, this already exists federally, and programs are kicked out because of not following what they're supposed to be doing with the program income. And if they can't prove what they're doing with program income, or can't prove that they're not eliminating duplicate discounts when they say they do carve out Medicaid claims, they also get kicked out of the program. So these safeguards already exist.
So I'm just going to add to my question, I guess, then. It sounds like, this program is rapidly expanded, and there's now tens of thousands of entities that have to be audited. Is anyone on the phone aware of the coverage of the audit? Is it something that you're audited every 3 years? Is it every year? Is it just random? And if so, what % of the overall organization group is covered in that audit process?
So, I can speak for how we do things. We do our own audits monthly on all of our claims, and then we have an external auditor come in every year to take a sample of all of our claims and audit them. Not all entities do that, but we do it so that way the integrity of the program is being met and stood up in case we do have a HRSA audit. The HRSA audit is not like a scheduled audit, though.
We do the same, and we actually had kind of a painful HRSA audit several years back, just because we didn't have some of the, as Tony said earlier, the guardrails in place that we probably needed to have in place. And so now we do an annual audit. We have our system office down in Springfield, Illinois, sends internal auditors up, but folks who have actually been contracted to come up annually and do that. And then, HRSA, I don't know how often that occurs. We've been audited twice in the last probably 8 years that I'm aware of.
So, okay, so it sounds like you guys have some really good best practices and guardrails that are in place that maybe go above and beyond what the HRSA is requiring in their audit system. Is that something that we would want to endorse as being part of this suggestion as a statewide item, to have essentially any organization that's participating in 340B to adhere to the guidelines that are your best practices in order to ensure that there's an acceptable HRSA audit?
So Apexis already recommends all of this stuff. So Brian, I don't know if you guys grabbed all your stuff off Apexis, but a lot of what you're talking about, Brian, actually exists through Apexis and being part of the Apexis training. And Apexis oversees and helps answer the questions for HRSA. So a lot of what you're talking about already exists. The guidelines of how to do things is on with Apexis, so it's out there.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone. That was a good discussion. I know we could keep on talking about 340B issues all day and spend a lot of time on these. We'll like I said, we'll look into what we can do to further refine this language, and if there are other places we can look to as potential sources of some kind of language that we can build off of. But I think there's a general understanding of what we're trying to get at with this recommendation, and recognize that to Alan's point, there are kind of two sides to the coin. But I think there's a right direction to go here. It's just a matter of if we can find what that recommendation would look like. So anyway, appreciate that. Appreciate the conversation. Appreciate all the feedback from everyone. So with that, we're going to switch over, look at the tier 2 items. What we have so far in proposed tier 2. And just as a reminder, these are the items that, have been raised, have been discussed. We have heard support from at least one, in some cases, a number of task force members. But we've also heard concern and opposition from members about each of these as well. So, in keeping with the charge of the executive order to summarize our work and, everything I said at the outset of the meeting, we do feel like it's important to at least include these. But, again, kind of putting them in a tier 2, recognizing that, if legislators, the governor, other policymakers want to look into these, they're more than welcome to, and there are some stakeholders who will be happy to work with them on it, but more analysis is needed outside of the work of this task force. So, again, we'll just kind of walk through these one by one. Want to have a good open discussion, solicit feedback from everyone. We'll be collecting that feedback, kind of updating and modifying what we have in here, which will then be reflected in the report. First item, which I know is contentious on both sides of it, really speaks to the copay accumulator issue. And the way we have it worded here is essentially allowing the manufacturer coupons to be applied to the deductible and annual maximum out-of-pocket costs if no generic exists, or if someone has gone through the utilization management practices, prior auth, step therapy, etc. One thing we've heard, I know there's very strong opinions from a couple different stakeholders. We also heard through the comment letter and the one-on-one phone calls that we had that, there are others who fully acknowledge that this isn't a fix long-term. This isn't addressing more of those macro considerations like we've talked about. However, for people where there isn't a generic option, being able to apply their coupon to their deductible can really make a difference in terms of affordability on an individual level. So, I'll open it up. I know we've talked about it, but love to get any more feedback on, people's thoughts about this or anything else, any comments you'd want kind of reflected in the official record, or any way you'd want this kind of revised or tweaked in terms of how it's reflected here.
So I guess I can just sort of share my thoughts on this. I actually was really excited by this idea, in part because it can make a direct difference for the folks who I hear from in my office who are saying, I'm buying drugs and I can't afford them, and I have this deductible, and then, what gets paid by these coupons and things doesn't even count toward it. Now this is a small example, but even for myself, I use an EpiPen, and I think about the coupons that Mylan puts out. And for a while I had no copay, right? Because Mylan put out this coupon. Then when they switched to the generic made by the same company, they put out a coupon for a $25 copay on the generic. So great, that'll save me a little money on my copay. But the reality was it saves me nothing, because it saves somebody else something, but I still have a deductible. So I'm going to end up paying that same total cost of my deductible. And I'll be honest, I don't remember if my deductible is $500 or $250, but whatever it is, I end up paying that in the long haul. So when I use that coupon, it delays me spending that money, but it doesn't actually save me money. And in my case, it's a small amount, right? It's a drop in the bucket, but there's no incentive for me to even use that coupon. I don't bother with it anymore because there's no point. I'd rather just get my deductible out of the way. But I think for folks who are struggling with the cost of healthcare more broadly and have some of these plans that have larger deductibles on them because that's what they can afford to do from a premium perspective, that they should get the advantage. If they are able to use a coupon on that, why not give them that advantage? And I get that the insurers may want that money, may want to be able to use that, or the PBMs or whomever. But it counters logic. I mean, why put coupons out there that are given to the consumer to use and then say, but that really doesn't save you money. It doesn't count toward your deductible. You're going to be paying it eventually. You're just delaying the inevitable. So I don't know. To me, I was disappointed to hear that there wasn't broader agreement. I'd be interested in hearing from folks who don't agree on this one, because I want to better understand the arguments against it. To me, it just seems like a really common sense, low-hanging fruit issue.
Thank you, Representative. Appreciate that. I think that's, it's really helpful, obviously, when you hear from constituents, you have that perspective of hearing from people who deal with this every day. So thank you. Alan, you have a comment? You want to speak to this?
Yeah, thank you. I'll speak to, as best I can, from what I understand, some of the limitations to this, and probably lean on others that have also added expertise. But I think there's a challenge here in what plans have to follow with regards to IRS rules and making sure groups, especially in the not-for-profit or ERISA space, have to comply with, especially with HSA support, and basically not allow, when they're using a copay card from a copay assistance program, to apply to deductible. And that's like IRS rule. And I think there's some pending interpretation because there's some conflicting opinion amongst several federal agencies, and that's about as deep as I can go with that. Every time I read it, I get confused, obviously written by attorneys, but basically there are limitations as to what plans can do, and to maintain IRS compliance, you're really not supposed to apply, only accept what the member truly paid out of pocket to the deductible. I think the second part of this is usually not an issue when there's a variable copay offset program used to help manage drugs to lowest net cost in aggregate for a group. Members are always informed as to the plan and its impact, and that they're never cost disadvantaged. So I just wanted to add that part. That's the second part of this. I hope that made sense, and if there's any other detail any could add, that would be appreciated.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I can't speak to the tax implications. I don't know if anyone else on here has more knowledge about that or can speak to anything that Alan said.
Hey, Nathan, this is Peter. Just to address the IRS rule, nothing's been finalized. We believe that they are misinterpreting the initial comments and rule. So we have been arguing with Treasury and Department of Labor to that effect. So, but as of now, there's been no finalization of anything with regard to how it treats high deductible healthcare plans with HSAs versus any other type of health insurance plan.
Hey, thank you for that. Alan here. I forgot to mention one other thing, and I think Brent had mentioned this at another meeting, that when you basically take down barriers of plan design, deductibles, certain tiering with copays intended to drive to lowest net cost or greatest value or better outcomes, then basically you see unfettered increase in utilization. And I think that's a problem when you allow that to happen. And that experience we had very clearly in groups that had combined pharmacy and medical, out of pocket no more than $250 a year, and basically utilization was through the roof. And when you change plan design to better manage that and have members experience a true out of pocket, you do have more consumerism involved and better choices being made. So I think there is a difference, and there's a second aspect to that, not necessarily just IRS rule and so forth. So just wanted to add to that.
Well, let me ask, I mean, the factor of having the coupon apply when there's not a generic available, does that change your thinking at all? Because I understand what you're saying, but it also seems like if people don't really have an option, anything that could help them afford the medication they need.
Sure. I mean, that's our goal here, right? Is to make meds more affordable to the consumer. I'm all for it. It'd be great to have some examples. I know in a number of instances, from a clinical perspective, with good knowledge, working with the physician and the member, perhaps generic alternatives can be found. and it's probably a lot deeper depending upon what disease we're talking about being treated. But it's a matter of what's IRS rule and how do we actually still manage plan design and not circumvent it, which is really what happens with copay and financial assistance. But examples might help. And then basically maybe there is a segment there that helps support at least that portion of applying copay assistance to deductible if compliant.
Yes, my opinion of this is that the member pays the same either way. So this isn't generating increasing the member cost or decreasing the member cost. It's shifting costs from the manufacturer to the plan. Because once it counts towards the deductible, then the plan pays more and more of the cost. If it doesn't count towards the deductible, the manufacturer copay assistance funds it. So either way, the member is kept whole in almost every situation. We're really talking about giving more dollars to the manufacturer from the plans.
So I'm hoping that you can help me understand what you just said about the consumer, about it not impacting the consumer. Because if the consumer goes and uses a coupon and it counts toward their deductible, then they pay less in the long haul. So if you have I'm going to use just a $500 deductible, keep it simple, right? And you have a coupon that's going to save $50 on your prescription. If that counts toward your deductible, you now pay $450 out of pocket over the course of the year to meet your deductible. If the coupon does not count toward your deductible, you're still eventually paying out of pocket that entire $500. Am I misunderstanding that?
So this gets very tricky, and a lot of times I have to draw this out, but I'll try to do it as best I can. So if you have a $500 deductible and a member goes to the pharmacy and adjudicates the claim and it's $500 and the member only uses a discount card and pays $50, if in that situation, if the card does not count towards the deductible, it looks like the member has fully paid their deductible, and the next time that they come in, they would pay their normal copay. So let's say they pay a $10 copay after their deductible is met. They would literally meet their deductible with one claim, actually have only paid $50 and not their $450, pay their $50, next time in, pay their normal copay. If the deductible counts, then they would come back in, they still wouldn't have met their deductible, they use the copay card again, they get the copay benefit assistance all the way through the process. So they use the copay card more when it applies to the deductible, and that's where the manufacturers pay more because they're using copay assistance more. And if you flip it, the plan pays all of that additional cost.
But the consumer ultimately saves.
The consumer generally pays about the same either way, because when they're using copay assistance longer to keep their costs down, they still eventually meet their deductible and then go on. But it depends on the drug, it depends on their copay before and after, it depends on the amount of the copay card. A lot of copay cards may be less than the member's copay after deductible. So in the case if the member's copay was $100 after the deductible was met, they still only pay the $50. They just keep using the $50 manufacturer coupon even after the deductible is met. So it's very benefit design and manufacturer copay card specific. So there are variations in each scenario, but generally speaking, the majority of the time, the member is not paying more. It is shifting costs from the manufacturer to the plan.
Nathan, it's Mike Goldrosen. One of the concerns I have with this is that even if we say, well, we're going to limit it to those products where there's no generic alternative, frequently there are, what I assume that would mean is that there's no generic alternative within that drug class itself. There may be still multiple alternatives to treat a medical condition. Some may have generics, some may not, some may have different costs. And it can shift because people do come in sometimes and say, well, rather than taking this medication, let's say the medication, they've got a $25 copay, and let's say it costs $100 a month, for example, but they have a copay card that will meet their copay for another product, and it's going to save them money at the counter, and so they want alternative drug, similar, another class without a generic to treat the same condition. But overall, that drug costs, $600 a month. So it does save the person money, maybe just using it, whether or not it's going to go to their deductible, but assuming it's going to go to their deductible, it saves them money at the pharmacy counter. But overall, it costs a lot more money. And, my personal feeling is that we want to lower the cost to people. And, I'm fine even lowering cost to consumers and spreading that out by slightly raising the cost to everybody, keeping it all equal. I mean, that's basically what insurance is for, right? Not everybody's spending everything that they would normally have to spend on something. But if it's going to overall, considerably increase the cost to everybody because we're paying for much more expensive products than we actually need, that's where my concern particularly comes in this type of situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Doctor. Appreciate that. Josh, did you have some comments?
Dr. Goldrosen made some of the same points that I was, but I did want to ask, because I didn't get this opportunity when pharma was in. Peter, do you know where this shows up on pharma's expense line? Is it marketing? Is it charity? What is it?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Ed, can you just rephrase it?
I mean, at the end of the day, this is money that pharma is funding. They're paying the copay, the co-insurance, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
How does pharma show that? As an expense?
I would assume, I don't 100% know the answer to that question. I would assume, yes, it comes out as an expense, but when copay accumulators, or at least the copay cards or discount cards, those are typically gone towards specialty drugs like that don't have the generic equivalent. Those are paid for through the negotiation with the rebates with the PBMs and the insurers. So I've been a little confused about this whole we're just shifting cost over the insurers. A lot of those discounts, especially for people in high deductible healthcare plans who are usually paying full list price, even though the drug cost has already been negotiated through the rebate, it's all baked in. So if you're doing the copay, we're paying up front for those copay cards so that people can use them to get a discount at the pharmacy counter until they hit their deductible. So I'm confused about the cost shift comments that I've been hearing so far in this conversation.
I mean, my overall concern is that coupons have the potential to drive, as Dr. Goldrosen mentioned, more costs because maybe people are not using the lowest net cost, the most efficient medication. But it seems to me overall, if we didn't have coupons, yes, it would hurt patients. I'm not suggesting we ban coupons, but coupons are an expense for pharma. Pharma gets their money from payors, so overall, it seems that coupons do drive up the cost of medications. It's not like it's just free money that is someplace. So there is an impact that coupons have. I appreciate the limiting it as this states, but that doesn't mean there are not variations between brand name medications. And we want to encourage patients to take the most effective, lowest cost brand name medication out of 4 or 5 brand name medications. Humira, $60,000 a year drug, $12,000 of coupon value that's on that medication. Are there other alternatives? Now in that class, I don't think there are a lot of alternatives, but that's just one example. There's huge value out there that I think is driving up the overall cost of prescription drugs. And to support that's where I have concerns. As a task force member, we're saying it's okay. Let's allow these people to get credit for money that they don't actually have coming out of their pocket. Pharma's paying for it. Let's give them credit for that. I go in for physical therapy. I don't have a physical therapy coupon that I can use. to lower my out-of-pocket costs? This is a very complicated topic. I just have huge concerns over policy that we may do to ban these programs.
This is Brian Stam. I'm just going to jump in here, and this might not be a great solution, but at least it's an example of something that could be done. Is California does have a model that they put in place that does prohibit manufacturers from offering discount repayment vouchers and other reductions in individual health plan out-of-pockets if there's a lower cost generic available within health insurance. It might be something that we would want to look into. I don't know if they've had success with it. I don't know how long it's been in place, but it is in place. So something we might want to model after if we want to go down this road.
Hey, Brian, it's Brent. I think that law, and I'm not 100% certain, but it's only for situations when there's an A-rated generic. So the exact generic equivalent, not a generic in a particular therapeutic class. So in the event that Lipitor goes generic and the atorvastatin's pennies, you can't use a manufacturer discount card on a $400 brand to get it to a $10 copay when there's a $10 generic available. But I think it's limited to those scenarios. And most managed care plans can manage those types of scenarios, are already managing those types of scenarios.
That makes sense. Thank you.
And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that essentially the reverse of what we're saying? We're essentially saying that you have to require that a coupon would count towards deductible if a generic is available, but then wouldn't the opposite be true by default? Or Brian, are you recommending that something be added, or another consideration be what you just said, what California is doing? Because I'm not aware of the law. I'm not fully understanding it.
I'm not an expert on that by any means, and I haven't looked at it. But this is just something that came up in our just broad scope review. In general, I agree that there's the cost shift on this is difficult to manage. In the end, if it's going to be better for the consumer in both the short and long run, which I don't think we have a solution for that yet proposed. Because the short run, the discount card looks great, but in the end, it's going to hit you on the premium. Not having it hurts up front, but in the premium, you might be better off. It's kind of a horse apiece in that one. So it'd be interesting to see if California's any success with this. But once again, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Robin, did you want to add something?
Just to kind of pile on, I guess, what everybody else has stated in different ways is, the employers, public or private, design their plans to provide a competitive benefit for all of their membership. And, limiting these coupons is just another tool in the toolkit that helps keep costs down. If you have a brand drug that is tier 2 and a member has a coupon that allows them to get tier 3, they're bypassing, that formulary incentive where that client may earn the rebate for that drug. So, again, I think it's giving the employer the opportunity to design their plan the way they need to in order to provide that benefit. Understanding that, yes, there is, definitely a consumer aspect to this that's, involved here.
Okay, well, thanks. I know we could talk about this one all day too, but I appreciate all those comments. We will look at maybe tweaking this language a little bit. And again, this is just being included as something that has been surfaced. And as we've heard, there is support for it, but also concerns and opposition as well. So we'll leave it there.
Nathan, can I ask one quick question
Yeah,
on that? I'm sorry. So my understanding of coupons and discount cards is all of the burden is on the consumer to actually present the card, to get the coupon, to use it. Why not then, if the consumer isn't getting any of the benefit, why not just shift that over to a negotiation that's made somehow between the insurers and the suppliers, manufacturers, instead of putting that burden on consumers to sign up for or obtain or get those when they don't actually get the direct benefit. So I don't know if that's just food for thought or whether it's something that someone can answer, but it's something I just don't, perhaps I don't understand how these cards and things work that well. I have used them, so I know the user experience. I'm not as familiar with what happens on the back end.
I would just add quickly that anytime a member uses those cards, the only person getting the benefit is the member. So it's being used to bring down their costs, whether it counts towards their deductible, lowers their normal copay, they don't have insurance. Anytime a card is being used, the member is getting the full benefit of that card. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but the member is always getting the benefit regardless of how it gets applied to their deductible or not.
Okay, so the benefit may just simply be that a delay is the money they spend, but that's considered the benefit they'd be getting from that framework.
Yeah, so a typical manufacturer copay card on a specialty product has a maximum value, maybe $12,000 to $15,000 a year, and the member copay, members out-of-pocket costs may be no more than $25 or $50. So every time they use that card, they pay no more than the $25 or $50, and the manufacturer is covering the difference between what their normal copay or deductible would have been and what that $25 is, up to a maximum of $12,000, $15,000 per year. Each card has a different value that's typically proportional to the cost of the drug.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Appreciate that follow-up. Thanks, Rep. Subak, for that question. Okay. So let's move on. I imagine there's going to be a little bit of discussion. I guess before we get to this one, I do want to acknowledge, I know when we brought up the PSAO issue, Scott Pace did mention that he wanted to comment. Just given the limited time that we have and that we have almost 40 public attendees, interested parties, we are keeping comments during this meeting just to the task force members, but Scott or anyone else who is listening as a public attendee, again, feel free to submit any comment letters and any feedback on anything that we talk about today, and we'll definitely read through that and include it in the official record as well. So with that, why don't we turn to the issue of drug affordability or accountability review boards. Again, this is separate from what we had talked about previously. This is more of, I think we've heard Maine as an example, looking at setting spending targets for public sector entities. Again, this is another one, I've heard strong support from some folks, strong opposition from others, and then others who are, kind of lukewarm and more interested in, how would something like this be structured, or, just more, a lot of questions around what we'd be thinking about something like this. So I'll open it up. Maybe Lisa, I don't know if you wanted to comment on this at all. I know this is something that you had mentioned as, policy of interest for you, not to put you on the spot.
Sure, no, that's okay. I mean, AARP in general likes the idea of these, and in part, it really grows out of, I think, the transparency discussion that we had earlier, and people kind of saying, okay, well, what does transparency really gets us? And in and of itself, it doesn't get us a lot, but it's a good building block. And I think, in conjunction with something like an affordability board, that's kind of the next good step in the transparency. And for us, we see it a lot in terms of being able to make sure that some of the pricing decisions that are made by manufacturers are reasonable and justified, and kind of just keeping in line with making sure that consumers see some of that benefit. So, I just think it's a really good thing to explore. I know there are a lot of issues with it. I know there's not a ton of precedents. yet, but I think it's something worth exploring as a way, in some ways, to get at that root cause. So I am interested to hear from other folks as well on this issue.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I appreciate that. Alan, can I hear from you as well? I know this is something that you had raised as being of interest.
Thank you. I support the concept. I think the way it's phrased here, it says create the board and let's march to spending limits or spending targets. Well, maybe that would be an outcome that would be necessary. I think a drug affordability and accountability review board has its initial purpose to gather information, be more transparent, to identify opportunities. My perspective, which I would fully embrace any such, is to collaboration and free markets to find opportunities to make prescription drugs more affordable and at the same time allow those to collaborate to maintain their wholeness financially. It'd take a lot of work to get there, but it's feasible. Imagine lowering prescription drug prices for consumers, yet we maintain the stability through reimbursement of the supply chain and reimbursement chain. I mean, that's a very high level vision, but that's what I would like to see happen eventually, because if we're just freezing drug costs, are we really solving a problem? So I like the idea to at least take steps to introduce the concept to form a board, and maybe it needs to be incremental over time, steps taken, kind of like an action plan, and maybe it's over 2 to 3 years to get to a point where specific recommendations can be implemented to achieve ultimately more affordable prescription medications for individuals.
I appreciate that. So, do you see it as kind of a managed competition model? Is that how you bring it? Almost like a public service commission type entity for drugs? Is that how you envision it?
Well, first, I'm open to hearing anything and anyone and everyone as to what they would think. But I think I like free markets because competition, if properly structured, should drive to the lowest net cost with some oversight to understand where we don't have value, we need to extract it from the healthcare system. Numerous models state about 30% of healthcare is unnecessary services. Now, I'm not going to believe that all 30% you can remove, but there's a good portion where when we're wise and use the right data, we can understand, becoming wiser, that quite frankly, maybe we're not accomplishing any goals that are good for the health of the public in certain areas. We need to understand that. That in itself is a huge step at lowering cost in aggregate for any group or public sector or private sector. But I do like the idea of free competition, allow those to bid maybe by therapeutic category. Let's get lowest net cost. Hypothetically, maybe what we do to help pharma join the conversation, let's model in pilot, let's get rid of rebates. There we go, accomplish one goal. So we lower the cost of drugs in aggregate, how much? By doing that, and then we start working towards lowest net cost, but then we need to manage utilization to value. I hope that was clear enough, but if not, I'm sure you asked some questions.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Since Alan mentioned it, Pharma, do you want to join the discussion?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we've talked about how, we've had plenty of our CEOs go on record that doing away with rebates would bring down list prices. But as far as drug affordability or whatever board if its goal is just to cap prices, and that's not something that we could be in favor of, because that would actually limit the availability of drugs. What happens if we can't agree to a price with a state affordability board, and now we're precluded from selling that product within that state? There's a lot of unanswered questions. No state has been able to tackle this properly. The closest that any states have come is Maryland, and they've already done away with the funding to create their board. So we don't know what's going to happen there. And there's questions about Maine and how that's going to work. And so, but to the extent that this is just about capping prices without actually doing anything more in terms of examining the full supply chain from manufacturer all the way to the patient, then it's not something that we can be in favor of.
I would agree, and I think it needs to be free market competition. I fully support that. But I think we also have to agree that we can't be supporting the use of products that are not driving value. We need to support free market competition to get to lowest net cost. Would you disagree with those two concepts?
We don't get in the middle of what is prescribed to a patient. That's between the doctor and the patient. If the doctor believes there is value in a medicine for their patient, then they should be able to get that medicine. But I'm not going to go comment any further than that.
Okay.
Well, I appreciate that. This is something, and Alan, to your point, we can revise how it's worded here. I mean, none of these are intended to be, stated in a way where we're saying do it tomorrow. So we can revise this wording to reflect that it's something that has come up. There's been some discussion, some interest. If people want to pursue it and look into it further, then there's, as to your point, Alan, there are ways to potentially structure something like this, things to think about, and obviously, Peter, to your comments as well, other kind of negative consequences that need to be thought through on the other side of it. So a lot to think about around this one, and I know we've talked about it. Happy to entertain any more comments at this point. Otherwise, I think we'll just put it on there as something that has been raised and can be looked at for further consideration.
This is Brian Stam. I would just add that not to tie two different items together, but if we were to go forward with some sort of centralized purchasing entity for the state, this may be an item that could be tackled in parallel. Seeing there would already be an entity kind of looking over the entire structure, this could be just an added benefit to that if it's structured appropriately.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Brian. Appreciate that. Like I said, that wasn't what the previous recommendation is focused on. But to your point, if this is something that policymakers wanted to pursue, they could have that discussion about incorporating it into something like that entity if that's what they wanted. So, okay. Appreciate the comments on that one. The next one, I think, we're all aware of this. We've talked about it before, recognizing there's a lot of issues. Some states are looking at this, federal government's involved with it. I know, Peter, you've, talked about some of the concerns in terms of safety of medication. We've heard that from others too, supply chain concerns. So I don't know if anyone wants to make any additional comments. I think we're all aware that this is something that's been on the table and for a while and continues to be looked at. So I don't know. I'll open it up. Any quick comments on this one?
Hey, Nathan, I just want to clarify one thing for the group. And I know we heard some presentations on this from NGA and a couple folks. And my concern is that those presenters made it sound like drug importation programs are up and running in states like Florida and Colorado, Utah. I just want to be very clear, they are not up and running. Nothing has been approved by the federal government yet. They have not realized any savings or even gotten as far enough to even set up a program yet. So I just want to make sure that was very clear from the outset, that there is no model for this to be following yet because nothing has been approved by the feds.
Sounds good. Thanks, Peter. Okay. So moving on, another issue that we touched on, I know, Robin, you had shared a document, and I know, Brian, you've made some comments about this as well. Robin, did you want to add anything more in terms of efforts that could be considered to ensure that specialty drugs are being administered in the lowest cost setting?
Well, our stance has not changed. I do think there are savings to having certain drugs administered in home setting where there's been demonstrated safety and able to look at the costs and do that comparison. I know OptumRx and I'm sure some other PBMs are also working on this. I think one thing that we're starting to work towards is integrating specialty drug management and with the pharmacy benefit in creating a network maybe, and some of this is future, so it's not fully baked yet, but creating some type of network on the medical side for some of those drugs that are being administered through the medical benefit that could be possibly administered through the pharmacy benefit to, apply some of those cost savings that we are, some of those discounts that we get through the pharmacy benefit, some of the utilization management programs that are in place through the pharmacy benefit could be applied on the medical side. And so we're anticipating a lot of exciting developments in that area to, help manage some of those costs that I don't think we've talked a lot about because they're just not as, transparent, and everything's been focused on the pharmacy benefit with these discussions. But I think that's an exciting area as well because, obviously that's all part of the total cost of care.
Nathan, I would just say, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Brian. Yep,
yeah, no, I would just say, certainly we would be opposed to any recommendation that would say that specialty drugs, it'd be mandated that they be administered outside of a hospital setting because so many specialty drugs require, certain preparation and administration that's only safe within a hospital setting. But I think where you have this on the list is appropriate. I think it deserves more discussion. Really, it is a case-by-case basis, depending on the drug, depending on the patient, depending on the situation. And I know you and I have had some discussions about, that's why I believe the better setting for this discussion is between insurance companies and healthcare providers, perhaps in the pre-authorization process or something like that, where it can be worked through on a case-by-case basis. But, if you're going to include it on the list, I think it's in the appropriate place in this section just to say it deserves more discussion.
I agree.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think we all recognize that we want to make sure that drugs are being administered in a safe way, and that's critically important. At the same time, I think everyone looks at the increasing cost of specialty medications and recognizing that's a pretty major cost driver, and trying to figure out, what solutions exist that we can look at around specialty. So appreciate your comment about, further consideration and looking at what this looks like. I agree, I think insurers and providers continuing to have those discussions is important. And, if there's anything from a public policy making standpoint that should be looked at, again, legislators, the governor are welcome to kind of dive into that further. But again, just an acknowledgement that this is a major cost driver and something that needs to be part of the discussion overall. Okay. So we'll move on to the next one. Obviously, we've had a pretty extensive discussion about this, the 340B program already. Not sure how much more we need to say about it at this point. I think we just put this item on, again, as an acknowledgement that there is interest in the program, and there is, from a number of stakeholders, probably a recognition that the program is being potentially misused in some cases. How we go about addressing that, especially at the state level, as we've talked about, is the big question mark. So, I think unless someone else feels like they need to make a point that wasn't made earlier, I think we can move on and just acknowledge that this one is on there for potential further consideration.
Yeah, Nathan, just real quick, and I said this before about the other thing, making sure that this isn't done in a way that burdens the people who are already doing this reporting and oversight, because it does exist and it's out there at a federal level. So adding something in a state level that is duplicative is going to create more resource burden. So just to be careful about not doing that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tony. And it's probably, anything that we would look at that could be done probably ties back into the discussion we had earlier, as opposed to just saying we need more reporting. So moving on, so, one thing we've talked about is this idea of, PBM best business practices. Some employers or some less sophisticated purchasers maybe are not aware of different PBM business practices. So is there some way to create some guidelines or just some resource guide that could be used to understand the various PBM business practices and maybe a kind of stamp of approval or what's deemed kind of by the industry as best practices? I've talked about this issue quite a bit about rebate pass-through and transparency and all the other issues as they relate to PBM business practices. So I'm not sure if others have, or if anyone has any comments they want to make on this point. Okay. Good. This will give us time for a discussion of our tier 3 items. So this is good. And then the last item here is just, getting back to a discussion. I think we had it on, it was either in November or maybe January, talking about, the pharmaceutical manufacturer patient assistant programs that do exist already, and just helping people become more aware of those programs that are out there. And I know, Peter, you talked about some of the initiatives that are already occurring around this, these efforts to increase awareness. So really, that's what this bullet is getting at, just saying, what can we do to make people aware of assistance programs that they might be eligible for? So I don't know if you want to mention anything about that.
I mean, I think I told you all before several months ago that, PhRMA as a trade association launched the medicine assistance tool, mat.org, MAT.org. And we're doing our very best to engage in a public affairs campaign to let people know that these programs exist. It's been very disjointed up until now, and this is the first time we've actually had all the companies participate in one website where you plug in the name of the drug that you're looking for, and it will take you exactly where you need to go. I just don't know. I'm not sure on what public policy can be put forward. I don't know what the laws or rules in Wisconsin state law about publicizing a private website or anything like that, or maybe some public website could pass along information. I don't know, but trying to get it out there has been a challenge. It's something that we've been working on for well over a year now, and we'll continue to do that. But I'm obviously open to any ideas on how to better publicize that these assistance programs are available and out there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think, just looking at it from OCI's perspective, not specific to patient assistance programs, but, I think we're always thinking about how can we help promote maybe what the private sector is doing. Obviously we have limited resources both to create programs, to do public affairs, public relations campaigns, but anything that can be done, obviously, within the proper channels to help people be aware of programs that can help them, I think it's worth looking at and considering. So.
Nathan, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Robin.
And this might be something for Peter to answer, but I don't want to put Peter on the spot either, because I don't even know the name of this drug, but this is something I've heard, and we have a family friend, so this is a personal story, but he is on a diabetic medication, and he was recently introduced to a patient assistant program through his physician's office. So it's my understanding that some of these patient assistance programs are brought to the patient, when they're in the doctor's office, when they're on a newly prescribed medication, or if the drug is an option for them. He's been calling, trying to get a call back just to get enrolled in the program. And there's wait times of up to 2 hours. They're going to call him back. He's been going on 3 months, I think, of trying to get into this patient assistance program, and the doctor's office has been trying to help him as well. And I'm not saying that's the case with every program, but is there an aspect of not only awareness, but access to these programs? It's one thing to have them, but if the patient is unable to get enrolled in them once they've been made aware, that's also a concern. And again, I'm not saying that happens in every instance, but it just happened to be something personal. I'm not going to go there with the name of the medication or anything like that, but is there an aspect of that you know, I've heard that in other instances as well? Is there some concern about access to the programs?
Yeah, and you know, Ian has brought up some of these things, and not all patient assistance programs, in terms of how easy it is to get through the paperwork and all that, they're not all created equal, and we understand that, and that's not something me as working for a trade association can address. But I'm happy to. I mean, Robin, I know it's a personal thing, but I'll reach out to you offline if there's something I can do to help out with your family friend. Please let me know. But I mean, some of these programs do require re-enrollment every year. Yeah, sometimes they do have a lengthy application process in terms of gathering the proper background data, income, all that, what, you know, insurance eligibility. So there are some things that have to be paperwork that has to be done in order to make sure that these patient assistance programs are helping the people that they're intended to help. But yeah, if there's any access issues that you all are aware of, please let me know, and I can raise that with the corresponding company. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. So why don't we move on to our tier 3 here. Megan, can you advance the slide? All right, so these are issues, as I mentioned earlier, these are all things that have been brought up just in the last few weeks, a number of them through the one-on-one calls that we've been having, and also from some just one-off emails and other correspondence that we've gotten. So, you know, there are issues that we haven't had a chance to discuss yet, haven't had a chance to vet, but because they have been raised by task force members and there is an interest in considering these, we did want to make sure they were reflected in this memo and will be mentioned in the report as things that were brought up. So, you know, with the little over an hour that we have left, I think let's talk through these. Love to get some feedback from everyone. I think we'll, you know, have a good sense of where people are in some of these proposals, but, you know, do want to take this opportunity to talk these through. So, so this is one, the licensure and regulation of pharmaceutical sales representatives. You know, some of the conversations I had and some of the correspondence basically made the point that, you know, others who operate, you know, as sales reps, you'd think of insurance agents and others in highly regulated industries. You know, there is regulatory oversight, there's licensure regulation. And so the point was made that similar oversight should apply to pharmaceutical representatives. So love to get any feedback on this in terms of, you know, why people think this is a good idea, bad idea, or just general comment. So I'll open it up.
Hey, Nathan, this is Lisa, and I think this is something worth exploring. I know we haven't really had a chance to look at it. I know recently there's been some model language created around this by NASHP, and I think that is worth exploring. I think if we're focused on a lot of the transparency pieces, this just adds another dimension to the transparency. And not to mention, you know, pharmaceutical companies spend a heck of a lot of money on this direct marketing to providers. In fact, way, way more than they spend on the direct to consumer advertising. And, you know, a lot of attention has been paid to that and how much it increases. And this is almost 3 times as much. So I think it's worth having those conversations and looking at this as, you know, just another tool in the toolbox as we're looking at a whole range of issues.
So I agree with Lisa's comments that it's something definitely worth exploring. And I think that there's some practices where pharmaceutical representatives may be providing skewed information to providers. So maybe some regulations around the type of information that's shared, as well as some regulations around the enticements that are provided to providers as well, and how to really monitor that.
That's good. Thanks, Sue. Appreciate that.
And this isn't a DOJ position, but something that I wanted to raise, at least in our lawsuit against Purdue Pharma, and I know in the opioid litigation that's been ongoing, but it is certainly that acts and practices of the pharmaceutical sales representatives were a large part of our allegations of wrongdoing by the opioid manufacturers in creating the opioid crisis. So again, not a DOJ position, but just something I'd like to highlight, that the practices of pharmaceutical sales reps are something that have been found to be concerning in past litigation.
Hey, Nathan,
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, I was just going to say, just a practical question, because I don't know a lot about how the pharmaceutical reps are hired and operate. Do they tend to be state-based, or do they tend to be more regional or national in origin? Because when I think about more the licensure side than the regulation side, I could see it being more complicated if these are folks who aren't necessarily based here in our state. So just curious if anyone can address how that all works.
Yeah, that's a good question. Can anyone speak to that?
Yeah, I can. It varies by company. Sometimes there are sales reps that are specific to one product. There's some that are regionally based or state-based. It just varies from company to company. But in terms of the comment about, saying unethical or improper things, the sales reps are not allowed to say anything that isn't already approved by the Food and Drug Administration. So there's a lot of federal oversight on exactly what information is conveyed to providers and how it's actually conveyed to them, in addition to plenty of sunshine laws that dictate what is actually done with that provider, whether it be, we've heard, pens given away and pads of paper with the logo of the manufacturer on it, that sort of thing. Those have been in place for a while now. So there's been a lot of federal oversight on how our sales reps or our companies interact with physicians and healthcare providers.
I would just jump in and note that even with federal oversight, that doesn't actually play out in terms of the practices. And the company Insys is a really great example. And if you're curious about some things that sales reps have done, you can Google their sales reps and their practices in talking to doctors.
Hey, Nathan, it's Tyler. I don't know if you have the answer to this or whoever brought this up has any insight, but have any other states done something like this to any extent that we can kind of look at as, I know somebody had said they had model legislation, but that any idea of if this is going on in practice in other states?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I have been made aware and actually had the model law from the National Academy of State Health Policy. They're the ones who created that model law that Lisa was referring to. But I'm not sure if any states have passed it yet. I'm not sure if there were other laws in place to this effect prior to this model law being created. I anticipate anytime you have a nationwide organization that creates a new model law, it typically leads to a lot of discussion around that topic. So I assume we'll be hearing more about this, but I don't know the answer to your question. I don't know if anyone else, if Lisa or anyone else has an answer to that.
No, I was scrolling quickly through the NASH piece stuff and I didn't get to the bottom, so I'm not sure yet either. I don't think so, but that's something we could easily find out.
This, Peter, there are two, Chicago and District of Columbia. And Laura, to your comment too, it's those laws that have allowed the attorneys and the lawsuits to be brought against those companies that have violated anything where they've said the wrong thing to providers or things that have not been approved by the FDA or had their tactics called into question.
And also our state laws as well.
Sure.
Which is why
Absolutely.
I'm advocating for more enforcement.
This is Laura. I guess will comment. I think that there are laws in place to address misrepresentations that are made. The distinction here, of course, is a preventative measure, right? And it allows you to get directly and have personal accountability on the ground level, as opposed to having to deal with these massive misrepresentation claims that go on and on and on and feed into the cases that the DOJ are bringing. So this licensure and regulation is not, it's not dissimilar to regulating attorneys or regulating real estate, right? Real estate agents. It's this idea of having a personal responsibility in your efficacy and your honesty at the ground level. So it's just one other arrow in your quiver, and it allows for a prophylactic, it allows for preventative measures, as opposed to coming at it from the back end after a cumulative effect of misrepresentations have the negative impact on the industry and the consumers and et cetera. So I think that's the distinction between the laws that are in place now and the proposal that is in DC and in Chicago. And not an uncommon phenomenon, particularly in an industry which has so much impact on the economy. To have that kind of regulation on the foot soldiers of the people selling the drugs is I don't think an unreasonable approach to take.
Thanks, Laura. I appreciate that perspective.
Nathan, maybe just more of a procedural question. Where would this regulation lie? Because when I was on a task force with PSW about pharmacy technician, either regulation, licensure, or certification. And at the time, there was a little pushback because there wasn't a lot of resources available to be able to oversee a new influx of people for that type of whatever was decided. If anything was decided, then there wasn't. So where would this regulation lie, and would there be an unintended stress on maybe the state to regulate something like this?
Yeah, so I mean, I would think that you could have the regulation, Department of Safety and Professional Services here in Wisconsin would likely be the agency that would have that regulatory oversight. And, I'm not going to speak to, I'm not advocating for, I'm just saying, looking at from OCI standpoint, so we regulate insurance agents, and there isn't any general fund tax dollars that are used. All the staff and the work that goes into the regulatory work of agents is funded by agent licensing fees and appointment fees and exam fees. So, if something like this would be enacted, I would think, there could be some type of fee structure put in place that could provide the funding mechanism for the staff and other regulatory framework.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, well, I appreciate all the comments on this. Obviously, I think a lot of interest, some support, some opposition to this idea. Again, like I said, when an organization like NASHB or others come out with a model law, it typically means there's going to be increased interest in the topic. So I imagine that this is one that we'll continue to hear about as we go into next session in the coming years. And then, we also touched on this next bullet, and it's kind of related to the first one. I think, and I haven't had a chance to dive into this in detail. I know, Peter, you kind of mentioned that there's another regulations in place in terms of what can be provided to physicians, healthcare providers. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on this in terms of thoughts on where there might be gaps that the state could look at filling, or if there are specific situations that people are concerned about that they feel the federal law just isn't addressing. But this is one that we had heard about as well. So I just want to get any feedback people have.
Nate, it's Mike Goldrose, and as far as the disclosure for physicians and what you get for gifts or honorary, that already exists. There's already databases out there. I looked myself up twice in 2 different databases while we were just talking right now, and others. So I mean that's already out there. I think that's already was it a federal law, Peter, or something accepted anyway within the industry over the past probably 10 years or so since that went into effect?
Yeah, federal sunshine law went into effect about 10 years ago. Anytime there's a gift, quote unquote, a gift, which is a payment or some sort of rendering of services or anything of value of $10 or more, you automatically get put on the registry. There have been some states that have tried to do this as well, and not taking into account the existing federal law. So if there is a harmonization between if a state wants to put their own thing on the books in addition to the federal law, all that industry's ever asked for is that it recognizes the federal law and it marries it as much as possible with the existing federal language.
Gotcha. Okay, no, I appreciate that. And like I said, I knew there was some federal laws, and I don't, maybe this falls under the previous discussions we had of, if state policymakers want to strengthen these, maybe there's working with the congressional delegation, or if there's something at the state level, I guess that can be looked at as well. But we'll just put that on there as a placeholder for now and move on to the next one. So this is an issue that came up in discussion about, increased PBM oversight, transparency around PBM practices. And one thing that was brought up is that, there's this increasing role of the PBM brokers and consultants. And, as we just had the discussion around the pharmaceutical sales reps, that, maybe there's a need to have additional regulatory oversight of these brokers and consultants and the increasing role that they're playing in the industry and the supply chain. So I don't know if anyone wants to speak to this or if we'll just leave it on there as an item for further consideration and move on. Okay. Similar thing with the next topic. So this came up again, as something to consider, basically as it says, just having PBMs be required to be fiduciaries acting on behalf of their plan sponsors, just ensuring that they're obviously doing what's best from a financial standpoint for their sponsors. So we'll leave that there. We'll move on to the next one. This is something, Yolanda, I think I'll turn it over to you. So there was an expansion during the pandemic for allowing pharmacists to practice in additional practice sites, which includes free and charitable clinics. And it sounds like there's, I know Yolanda expressed some support for allowing that to continue, long-term permanently, essentially, to address, as we've talked about before, some of the staffing issues when it comes to, the clinics not being able to have pharmacists on staff. So Yolanda, did you want to speak to this at all, or Ian? Any comments on this?
Yeah, it's from Wisconsin statute 450.02, and it had been extended actually twice, but it allows for pharmacists to practice in locations that aren't licensed pharmacies. And so that would help, especially in the charitable clinic space, where they may not actually have a licensed pharmacy, but they may have pharmacists that do provide some guidance and oversight for patients. It just formalizes that process and ability and gives the pharmacist more latitude to do the work with the patients. We also have a remote site in Marinette, Wisconsin. So we mail prescriptions to Marinette. There is a nurse clinic manager that receives the medications, and we do actually have we have a volunteer pharmacist from the community that actually provide consultation to the patients. But when there are cases where the patient's not, when the pharmacists are not available, we were advised that we needed to have that clinic be considered a remote dispensing site. And so being classified as a remote dispensing site requires that there are inspections and visits, and Marinette is quite a ways away from us. And so that just creates additional barriers. And this is a very specific lane that we think could just simply be addressed through this variance that has already been granted in the past for this particular practice type.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that input. And I think this is definitely something, as we have the broader conversation and, thinking back to the other policy recommendations related to supporting free and charitable clinics, I think these ideas are just additional items that we can think about to provide additional support. So thanks for that. Any other comments or questions on these items?
Hey, this is Lisa. I don't have 450.02 in front of me, and I probably should know this, but the expansion was specifically related to free and charitable clinics. Am I correct?
Actually, no, it was expanded for all pharmacy, throughout the state, so that they could practice, curbside or set up a, a space that was remote in case, yeah.
Got it. But what is being talked about here would be not to leave the full exemption in place, but specific to free and charitable clinics. Is that what you're recommending?
Yes, that's what I'm recommending. But I mean, I guess it could be something that could be considered as we move into this new era. We are changing a lot of the ways that we practice and deliver care, and telepharmacy in particular. In Wisconsin, we call it remote dispensing. That really provides some opportunities for pharmacy care to be delivered perhaps in different ways than it traditionally has been.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thanks, Yolanda. Appreciate you bringing that up. Brent, did you have a comment? No. You just popped up on my screen, so.
Oh, no, nothing here. Fully support. No concern.
Okay, moving on, we have a couple DOJ items. So I'll mention them, and then Laura, I'll turn it over to you if you have any additional comments. But the first one would be to allow DOJ to have direct civil investigative demand authority without needing to seek court approval for each time. And then the second one would be looking at creating a specific healthcare fraud division within DOJ. So Laura, do you want to comment on these, provide a little more background information?
Sure, and just to clarify, for the first one related to CID, Civil Investigative Demand Authority, what I'm suggesting here is specific to antitrust. Sorry, that's my cat. To antitrust authority, we already have that for our MISREP authority. So again, just CID authority for antitrust cases. And we have one of the more restrictive laws in the country on this point. And I know I pointed out to you other states like Florida is a good example of a law that we would look to emulate. And then the second one, I think that may have been a little bit of a misunderstanding. I was drawing attention to the fact that some other states in their departments of justice have specific healthcare fraud units within their consumer protection section. But again, back to our first recommendation being to expand the number of staff for consumer protection and antitrust, just a recognition that with more staff, we would be able to dedicate more staff to healthcare fraud cases. So that's where that angle comes in, but happy to discuss further.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for misrepresenting what you had said there. I jotted down my notes were not accurate.
I don't have a DOJ authority to say that, and don't want to misrepresent my own authority.
Well, and it's just, right now it's just a thought bubble on the memo. So, further consideration and, potential further thought. So appreciate you bringing that up. Any questions, comments about those items?
Love the idea of having extra people for healthcare fraud, though. I think there's a huge need for that in lots of ways. So totally support that.
I would just echo Laura's comment. I understand she doesn't have authority to ask for dedicated healthcare unit, but I will say, I was once a DOJ, and the consumer protection attorneys over there are in charge of consumer protection law with every single industry, telecommunications, healthcare, you name it. And so they have to be experts in all things. And as we all know, the pharmaceutical industry is very well protected and represented, and having experts at the DOJ that can match that, not that they aren't doing an excellent job, they are, but having the resources and this the subject matter expertise for this type of law is would be very useful to the department. So
And I don't dispute that. And Laura had worked on healthcare fraud cases when she was at DOJ, so she's a great resource as well.
Sure. Thank you both. And Laura, while we have you, do you want to touch on the next one, the additional restrictions on improper drug marketing and advertising?
Well, I think this is, oh, you go ahead, Laura. I didn't know.
No, I was going to say you should start, Laura, and then I'll fill in.
Well, so thanks for adding this additional point in here. It sort of dovetails on the conversation we've already had with respect to sales representatives and the amount of misrepresentations we often see in the cases that are being brought around the country and by DOJ. So having more prophylactic restrictions on the type of representations that can be made is something I think we should be exploring or could explore. Of course, there's significant First Amendment issues attached to any type of restrictions on marketing, and so it's not an easy analysis, but one worth contemplating because it does result in a significant amount of harm when exercised. And I know other states have also taken a look at this, in particular, given the amount of money that is spent on marketing by the pharmaceutical industry. It has a significant impact. So, Laura, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this.
Nope, I support everything you just said. Thank you.
Hey, this is Brent. I just have a question related to this one. Would this expand? And I know the current administration had come out with some regulations or proposed regulations about having to disclose like the cost of a product when a manufacturer is doing advertising, similar to how the side effects are disclosed during any advertisement. I don't know if this could be done at the state level, but would there be any thought as part of this one, including more disclosure of what the actual list price is of particular products?
That is directed at me. I haven't contemplated affirmative disclosures on pricing. Certainly you see that in other instances, affirmative disclosures and affirmative material disclosures, particularly if you're doing targeted marketing to someone or to an entity, having an affirmative disclosure about all the material terms would include a price. And certainly that's something we could contemplate, but it's not something I could speak to intelligently right now. Laura, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, but it's something to consider.
Thank you.
Hey, this is Peter. Just keep in mind that when it comes to the marketing and advertising, all of that, everything that is said and anything and we do is approved by the FDA. When it comes to giving the list price on the TV ads, there's some companies that are already doing that proactively. There's some that aren't, but there's First Amendment issues that come into play when we talk about the marketing, especially on the 30-second ads, when we're only allowed to, or only forced to give over the side effects and the essential information that's on the label from the FDA.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone. So just the last two items, both kind of related. I did hear from a couple folks just a general interest in what Minnesota is doing around their insulin safety net program. Not sure if anyone wants to comment on that. I know there are a number of stories and out there that people can find about that program, but did any members want to comment on that? Share their support? Okay. All right, we'll just leave that on there. And then the last one, it's something that Alan, I know you had touched on earlier with your comments. I'm not sure if you want to say any more about it at this point, or you feel like what you said earlier kind of covers it.
Well, I think it just is a little bit down the road. The concept is to think differently, and how can we get a competitive bidding process at the same time drive to better value and get better outcomes for people with diabetes, get rid of wasteful spend. And I think that would be something that would go into the affordability and review board, albeit if stakeholders at the table all want to participate, wouldn't it be useful to at least start looking at how do we pilot to get better outcomes and lower cost, and especially in this population, it is in aggregate spend one of the top 3 on the pharmacy, and of course by sheer numbers on the medical side, it drives a huge amount of spend with disease progression leading to cardiovascular events, chronic kidney disease, all the way up to end-stage renal disease. Dr. Goldrosen is very well aware of this. We can do a better job with this and might be able to better manage costs. So I think it is just something that I think if we think differently and perhaps kind of mature some efforts, perhaps we can actually look in this area.
All right, thanks, Alan. Appreciate that.
It's Mike Goldrosen. Since you brought my name, I mean, I think, you know, these are certainly things we could try to do to drive down costs, and it wouldn't necessarily be something we would limit to diabetes. I mean, that's obviously a very prevalent disease with, you know, high burden to society, but there are other places as well. I mean, anywhere where we can look at value, whether you use more expensive medications, but you ultimately drive down the cost of taking care of the medical condition and suffering, or whether you drive prescribing and utilization to lower cost but higher value, medications or therapies. It's always quite useful. It could drive down the costs overall quite a bit, perhaps.
Thank you for that input.
Yeah, and I feel like it is part of a broader discussion that's happening around, interest in moving towards more value-based care, and how can we look at doing that when it comes to medications and on the pharmacy side. So, as you said,
Well,
Alan, probably.
And I'll be very brief. My concluding point is that there's a lot of spend there that doesn't drive outcomes, and that is just related to the polypharmacy that doesn't drive reduced cardiovascular event risk in an efficient manner. So it's wasteful spend, and that's one way to drive value and lower drug cost burden to individuals and groups.
All right, so we've reached the end of the list of items that we have. Because this does continue to be an evolving document, and it is, we have, it's about 1:15. I want to open it up and just see, are there other items that should be included on here? And I guess before I do open it up, one thing I want to acknowledge is that, from the outset, we felt that it was really important to have, a very diverse membership of as many, relevant stakeholders involved in this discussion as possible. We really thought it was important to have as many different perspectives represented and at the table as we could get, which I think has made for really good discussions. I think we've had a lot of good ideas put on the table, but it also means that it's challenging, if not impossible, to reach any kind of consensus or general agreement for what big policy items can be supported. Because I can ask, and I've seen this already from the discussions we've been having as part of this group offline through the different comment letters, and I can ask one group of stakeholders and they'll have one set of recommendations, and then I'll talk to someone else and they're on the other side of the issue. So we all know that. I mean, it's not a surprise to anyone here, and so I just want to acknowledge that this document, the way we've structured, the framework for these recommendations takes that into consideration and reflects the fact that we do have these diverse perspectives. And, we have felt that it was really important to have all of these voices represented around the table through this process. So, I guess I'll just open it up and say, what other things would you like us to at least include in here as things that, as task force members, you feel should be referenced even, in this tier 3 section, just so they're, included in the official record and they can be considered for further consideration by the governor or the legislature that we haven't touched on and that aren't in this document. So I'll open it up. Any comments, any input on that? Nothing? I can't believe we covered all of it. I know everyone doesn't agree with that because I've heard from many of you about that. I guess, the other thing I'd love to get any input on, I fully acknowledge the comments that I've heard from some people saying, some of these are really good. I support these ideas, but they're really not getting at the real core of what's driving drug costs. And again, to the comments I just made, I get that, I understand that. So any thoughts or perspectives on how that should be addressed, given the dynamic that we have with this task force and the diverse perspectives that we have around this table?
So, hey, this is Lisa. This is something that I've thought a fair amount about through this task force and through the discussions we've had, and particularly looking at these recommendations. And I don't know if there's a way to sort of delineate, but clearly there are things that could have a more immediate impact on consumers that might not actually drive down drug costs. And I think in some cases, they might actually, at least to a small degree, have the opposite impact overall, even if it's saving the consumer money, right? So there are some things that could be targeted consumers, some of which could have a net positive, some of which may have a positive for the consumer, but may or may not actually have a net positive effect. And then you sort of do have these more macro level things, which I think, and this may come partly from my perspective as a legislator who works with constituents talking about these issues, but I think many of the things that might help drive down costs, and again, sort of thinking about that distinction between costs and prices, right? Consumers care more about prices than they do about costs, but theoretically, at least, driving down costs or reducing costs should also reduce and drive down prices. I'm not sure that always happens. And I think to the extent that that does happen, though, for our constituencies, for the average person going out and paying for prescription drugs, whether insured or uninsured, whether with or without discounts and all sorts of things, often the things that drive down costs have a very slow and very moderate impact on the actual individual consumer. So even if they're going to feel those savings, it's not going to happen quickly and it's not going to happen in large increments. And I don't know, I think about this report and how we address these things. I do think it's important to sort of flush out a little bit some of those distinctions that I believe are there. I mean, assuming that I'm right about that, that there really are differences in sort of the macro and micro levels of this, and the things that might make the biggest difference at the micro level aren't necessarily the things that help fix the system. And the things that address bigger systemic changes will eventually, maybe the words trickle down, although I don't like using that terminology, but will eventually work their way to the consumer. But the consumer may not feel or see that, at least certainly not quickly or, as I said, in large increments. So I don't know, that's just something I'm wrestling with this, and that I don't know if there's ways to sort of reflect those differences in the report. Clearly, I'm not the most articulate at describing those, but sort of how I see it from the non-medical person's point of view.
Yeah, thank you for those comments, Representative. And, and I think that's accurate for a lot of the consideration, and that, maybe gets to some of our, the comments and discussions we've had around the need for more transparency, recognizing, again, transparency doesn't solve the problems, but if we are, working towards the more macro solutions, then transparency can help us understand if those macro changes are trickling down to the micro level. yeah, I guess I don't have a clear answer. It's something that, you know, frankly, I've been wrestling with myself, and I think the more we work through this, there's no clear answer to it.
Thank you. I would also just, to what you just said, one thought that triggers in my mind is some sort of, and reporting is probably not quite the right word, but some sort of mechanism to measure success, right? Like when we think about what's the outcome, because we talk about all of these things we can do, and particularly those that make very small incremental differences over a period of time. I believe we should be recommending that there's some sort of measurement tool that's used to measure the outcomes of whatever changes eventually come out of the recommendations of this task force, because that's the only way we'll know if we were successful. And if things are successful, we can build on those. And if there are things that we recommend that eventually get enacted that turn out not to be successful, we need to know that too, so we can make changes.
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, Nathan, I was gonna kind of echo those comments. You know, one of the things I think in the first meeting I mentioned was this is a giant balloon, and depending on where you push it, it's gonna have impact in different places. But the task of the objective of the task force is to help the patient and to figure out what we're doing, how we measure that. There's been a number of different times where we've talked about what's being done in different states, and then there's always a follow-up question, is it working? And it's usually not really sure. So if we could be a model, if we could think about it as us being a model of being able to be pointed to in a year, 2 years, 3 years of what actually did impact the patient, I think that would be a huge win. The people you put together on the task force, to your point, there's a number of varying views, but I feel like everybody had the opportunity to give their opinions and ideas and thoughts very respectfully. So I think that the task force leadership did a really good job with how this was structured.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate that feedback.
And I'll kind of echo, I think, what other people are saying as well. It would be great if we could measure this. And I think, you know, one of the ways we can measure will be just the number of people within our state who are able to take their medication because they can afford it. Because right now we have way too many people who can't afford it. And there are other measures as well, but I'd certainly love to see that as one. And I think just one of the acknowledgements, and it goes back to what Representative Subek said, in terms of there's not one answer to this problem, and I think we have to acknowledge that at the outset. It's, you know, there will be some things that are maybe small that are building blocks up to bigger things, and I think that's okay. And I think we just have to make sure that people understand. I mean, people do understand that, but you know, others outside of this task force understand that it's going to take a lot of different pieces to get at the place we want to be, where people in our state can actually take the drugs that they need.
Well, and you're right, Lisa. And at the end of the day, I mean, that's what it's all about, right? I mean, yes, reducing prescription drug prices is important, but it's really making sure people can afford the medication they need. That's the end goal. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Question, based on all that, what we have here that's going to move forward, would it help then to go through each one of these? Not that I want to do that here, but to rate each one by likelihood of impacting out-of-pocket costs to the consumer directly, immediately, or long-term, or is this an indirect impact? Or is it unknown? Therefore, those that get handed this document have a better idea what the weighting is and ease of interpretation of the likelihood of moving on certain categories. Would that be beneficial?
Well, I'd say, you know, Alan, I think that's something that could be reflected in any comment letters that people want to submit. You know, I don't necessarily want to make it a requirement where everyone has to, you know, submit a document walking through each of these items. But, you know, as I said before, we welcome any additional comments, either by, you know, the public, interested parties, or any of you want to submit some comments, either to what you just said, Alan, or just if people feel like there are items here that you really want to reinforce and highlight as things that you want to see the legislature and the governor carry forward, or vice versa, obviously. That's where, again, this document's kind of the foundation, or the framework for laying out what the different policy considerations and options are. And then all those comment letters and the discussions will reinforce, why some of these should be considered, and they merit, further support, frankly, but also helping understand why there might be downsides to these. I mean, that's one thing I think as we've talked through all of these, some of them sound really good on their face, but the more you talk them through, there are some concerns, and not to say they're complete disqualifiers, but things that need to be worked through if any of these, if some of these are going to be advanced. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, feel free to submit comment letters that say exactly what you want to say, Alan, and we'll definitely take that into consideration.
Fair enough. And before we forget or time runs out, I want to thank you, Nathan, Jen, Megan, and others on your team, Nathan, for bringing this together and facilitate the herding of the cats. A large effort. Thank you very much for everything you've done.
Absolutely. I second that as well. And I think the team did a great job of capturing all of the different conversations over the last 9 months and getting it into a couple of pages. And I think did a great job of kind of getting it into the 3 buckets as well. That was no small task. So congratulations, Nathan, to you and Jennifer and the rest of the team that worked on this, because it's very well done.
Thank you.
I also
appreciate that. Really appreciate the feedback.
Thank you for everything.
Yeah, thanks, Yolanda. Yeah, we've really had a great team. I mean, we've had, with Megan running the logistics and figuring out as we've had to switch to the virtual meeting, really just done a great job with our, public affairs and communications team, with Derek and Jessica and Jeff helping, and then, Jennifer really being the point person on all things prescription drug policy and helping to stand this whole task force up and think through how do we structure this thing. It's really been a great team effort. So thank you for recognizing that and acknowledging it. Appreciate it. And I want to thank all of you. I mean, we put in 8 meetings, 4 hours each, a lot of time offline, having discussions, reading a lot of materials. Obviously, you're all busy people. I know you have day jobs and you're dealing with the pandemic on top of it. So, we really appreciate all the work and your time commitment through this whole process. And I want to reinforce, I know I've said it many times, but I think it's important just to reinforce that this, I really do view, and I know, conversations with governor staff, with legislators, this work is the first step of collecting all these ideas, of sifting through, figuring out where some things might merit further analysis and consideration, where there's some concerns and opposition. And then, this report that we're going to issue in September is going to reflect all of that work, but really it'll be a passing of the baton as the next step of the work starts to happen, where, they start to, policymakers start to dive into this in more detail, continue to have some of these discussions, maybe reach out to each of you, reach out to other stakeholder groups for further information, and really determine, okay, which of these do we want to carry forward? Which of these do we think, we can get support for, and which are worth putting the time into? So even though, right now they're just kind of high level policy proposals on paper, this isn't the end. They'll continue to get built out and these ideas will be carried forward. So, as I've said before, I appreciate your time up till this point, but I also appreciate all of you and the groups that you work with continuing to stay involved in this process as we transition to the next steps in the process. So I think that brings us to the end of our time together, at least for now. I guess that's the last thing I'll mention here is, so this is our last meeting scheduled for this year. At this point, we're not going to formally disband this task force. There's been some discussion about maybe when the governor's budget is introduced next year, or when we get into the legislative session and there's some interest in legislators pursuing some of the legislation coming out of this work, maybe we'll get back together for further discussions. The other topic for discussion might be if, around a COVID vaccine, any policy considerations that we would want to talk about. So right now there's nothing definite planned, but just know that we might be getting back together again next year, but for 2020, this will be the end of it. And again, thank you all. Really appreciate your time and your expertise. And I know I personally have learned a lot, and I think a lot of good ideas have come out of this process. So thank you.
Nathan? This is Robin.
Yes.
I have a quick question. Thank you for everything. You've done an excellent job leading this task force, and I'm so happy to have had the opportunity to participate. Is there a time frame by which you'd like any further comments, letters, anything that we would like to submit? I know you had mentioned towards the end of the year you'd be handing off the information, but is there a specific time frame that you would appreciate getting some of that information back?
Yeah, if we could get, and good question, actually, and that on my list of something to mention, and I totally missed it. So thanks, Robin.
Sure.
If we could get the comment letters by the end of this month to ensure that they can be included with the report that we submit.
Okay.
Obviously, as all of you and the organizations you work with are, you're aware of how the policymaking process works. Obviously, there will be additional opportunities for comment beyond that. But as far as the formal comment process as part of the report by the end of this month is what we're asking.
And Nathan, will committee members see the report before it's finalized and or released?
Yeah, the exact timing hasn't been worked out, but we can work to make that happen.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm getting it flagged for me here schedule-wise that maybe you want to hold on. How about the end of that first week of September, September 4th, Robin, for comment letters?
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Because the end of the month is, yeah, next Tuesday. It gives everyone a few more days then. Okay. All right, well, we actually got done ahead of schedule, which I'm amazed by, but everyone gets, 20 some minutes back. So that's always a good thing.
Thank you, Nathan.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you, Nathan.
Appreciate it.
Everyone.
And everybody.
Here, thanks for
Thank
all
you
your
very
work.
much.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.